There is a certain silence that follows every great game. It arrives not with the whistle, but with the echo that lingers when the crowd is gone. I have stood outside stadiums long after the final drive, when the air still hums with the ghosts of cheers and the night carries the weight of celebration. The lights stay on longer than they should, as if unwilling to admit that glory was temporary. Beneath that glow lies a truth we rarely face. The concrete and steel monuments we worship in the name of sport do not rise without sacrifice. And the ones who pay for them are rarely the ones who celebrate inside. I remember walking through the shadow of one of these modern cathedrals, a billion-dollar stadium built on land once meant for families and small businesses. The neighborhood was promised renewal, jobs, and pride. Instead, what came was dust, displacement, and debt. The team called it progress. The city called it opportunity. But for the people who lived there, it became a story of quiet loss. Their homes, their schools, their clinics disappeared in exchange for something they could never truly own. When you stand at the edge of an empty parking lot after a sold-out game, you can feel the contradiction pulsing beneath your feet. Every painted line, every concrete pillar, every pane of glass reflects both triumph and burden. The stadium stands like a monument to competition and unity, yet it is financed by a kind of division. It draws from the wallets of many to enrich the few. We call it civic pride, but pride has a price that is rarely written on the scoreboard. In America, sports have always been our great escape, a ritual that binds communities together across race, class, and ideology. Yet behind every new stadium ribbon cutting lies a trail of public debt and political theater. City officials speak of economic impact while consultants sell projections that never materialize. Teams promise jobs, tourism, and downtown revival. And when the numbers fall short, the cost is quietly passed to the same taxpayers who bought the tickets in hope of a better tomorrow. I once met a teacher from St. Louis who watched her city lose millions in subsidies after the Rams left for Los Angeles. She spoke not of betrayal by the team, but of disbelief that her city had ever believed the promise. "We paid for their home," she told me. "And they still left when they found a better one." That single sentence holds the essence of this story. Stadiums are not built for permanence. They are built for leverage. For decades, the playbook has remained the same. A team threatens to leave. A city panics. Studies appear showing supposed billion-dollar benefits. Local leaders declare urgency, and soon, public money begins to flow toward private enterprise. Bonds are issued. Taxes are restructured. The people are told that this is investment, not loss. The ground breaks, the speeches are made, and the cameras capture a moment of unity that hides a deeper fracture. The debt, like the echoes after the game, remains long after the players and politicians have moved on. Every time I look at one of these gleaming structures, I see layers of contradiction. Beneath the luxury suites are janitors working double shifts to make rent. Behind the fireworks and halftime shows are neighborhoods stripped of resources. The same hands that clap for touchdowns often struggle to pay the taxes that made the moment possible. And yet, the love for the game endures. That is the brilliance of the design. The very passion that fuels the sport shields the system that profits from it. Sophie Stadium in Inglewood, Allegiant in Las Vegas, AT&T in Arlington. U.S. Bank in Minneapolis each carries a story of civic ambition entangled with corporate gain. These are not just stadiums. They are statements about who we are willing to serve in the name of identity. The architects call them landmarks. Economists call them liabilities. To the fan, they are sacred ground. But to the city ledger, they are obligations that stretch decades into the future. I remember the night Sophie opened. Billions had been spent, financed through layers of public incentives and hidden costs. The crowd roared under a roof of glass and light, a marvel of engineering and excess. But outside the walls, local businesses that had once lined the streets were gone. Their owners could not afford the rising rents that followed the project's arrival. The team called it revitalization. For many who lived there, it felt more like erasure. It is easy to be swept away by the spectacle. The music, the fireworks, the national anthem, the hero shots. These are the rituals of belonging, and they are powerful. We forget that belonging itself has been monetized. Every seat license, every parking fee. Every tax increment district is part of a system designed to extract emotion and translate it into revenue. We do not just buy tickets, we buy identity, and in the process, we finance empires built on our collective faith in the power of sport. The paradox is that we love what these places represent: community, pride, achievement. They become symbols of our cities, postcards of ambition. They appear in drone shots and tourism ads as proof of progress. But when the confetti falls and the seasons change, the bills remain. The same voices that spoke of legacy now speak of maintenance costs, bond refinancing, and deficit adjustments. The same leaders who promised renewal quietly shift blame to previous administrations. The cycle repeats because the illusion is too valuable to break. The deeper truth is not about football or even economics. It is about how power disguises itself as passion. The modern stadium is the perfect metaphor for the American story. Grand on the outside, indebted on the inside. It is a theater where loyalty is tested and monetized. Where ordinary citizens become silent investors in a dream that was never theirs to control. The field becomes a sanctuary, the team a religion, and the city the congregation that pays the tithe. I have walked through empty corridors of stadiums after everyone has gone home. The air smells of concrete dust and faint echoes of celebration. In that silence, the real cost becomes clear. These are temples not of worship, but of compromise. We trade resources meant for schools and hospitals for moments of collective euphoria. We convince ourselves that a new stadium means progress, even when progress never reaches the people who need it most. History will remember these structures as engineering marvels, but it will not easily record the quiet erosion they caused. The teacher whose classroom lost funding. The family priced out of their neighborhood. The city worker laid off when budgets tightened. Their stories do not make highlight reels, yet they form the foundation on which every cheer rests. We have mistaken applause for prosperity. And when the sound fades, what remains is the debt. The stadiums will keep rising, each larger, brighter, and more expensive than the last. Each will be hailed as the future of entertainment, the pinnacle of community investment. But beneath every new foundation lies the same question we refuse to answer. What are we really building, and who are we building it for? Until we confront that question, we will continue to trade substance for spectacle, believing that the echo of applause is worth the silence that follows. Because in the end, when the lights go out and the parking lot's empty, the truth stands uncomfortably clear. The cost of applause was never measured in tickets or trophies. It was measured in taxes, in trust, in the quiet loss of what once belonged to the people. These are not just the stadiums of the NFL. They are the monuments of a nation that forgot to count the cost of its own pride. There was a time when a stadium was a neighborhood affair. The field was carved from the earth by local hands. The bleachers built by volunteers, the lights strung by men who believed in the simple joy of gathering to watch their team play. It was a community project, paid for through small donations, city bonds, and pride. Those early stadiums were not perfect, but they belonged to the people. They were extensions of the towns themselves, places where the same families who paid the taxes also swept the stands, painted the lines, and kept the gates. The ownership was shared, both in spirit and in cost. The cheers that filled those early grounds carried the sound of collective investment, not corporate ambition. Over the decades, that spirit changed. The game grew bigger, richer, and more commercial. Television brought the spectacle into every home, and with it came sponsors, naming rights, and profit margins. The stadium, once a symbol of local unity, became a new kind of monument. No longer just a field or a civic gathering space, it evolved into a financial engine, designed to extract as much value as it could from emotion. It was no longer about how many people could fit in the stands. It became about how much each of them could spend. What began as a field of dreams transformed into a monument of debt and influence. The shift began quietly in the mid-20th century, when professional sports grew too large for the civic budgets that once sustained them. Cities competed for teams, each promising better facilities and sweeter incentives. Politicians realized that sports franchises carried emotional weight that few other institutions could match. Bringing a team to town meant jobs, attention, and political favor. Losing one meant outrage, protest, and blame. Out of that tension was born a new financial instrument, the public-private partnership. The phrase sounded harmless, even progressive. It suggested collaboration and shared benefit. In reality, it became a tool for transferring public money into private hands. Cities would issue tax-exempt bonds to finance construction. The teams would contribute a smaller portion, and both would celebrate the deal as a win for everyone. The reality was harder to see. While the owners reaped profits and the cities shouldered debt, the public narrative remained wrapped in the language of civic pride. Consider the scale of the transformation. The early multi-purpose stadiums of the 1960s and 1970s cost tens of millions to build, and many were paid off within a generation. The new breed of stadiums now cost billions, with financing that stretches for decades. SoFi Stadium in Inglewood cost more than $5 billion. Allegiant Stadium in Las Vegas cost nearly $2 billion. AT&T Stadium in Arlington and U.S. Bank Stadium in Minneapolis each crossed the billion-dollar threshold. In most cases, these projects involved complex layers of taxpayer subsidies, hotel taxes, infrastructure spending, and long-term public debt. The projects are often justified as economic investments, yet few of them ever deliver on the promises made before construction begins. Economists have studied the phenomenon for years, and their findings are remarkably consistent. Stadiums rarely create significant new jobs. They do not generate long-term tourism or sustainable economic growth. The revenue they bring in often displaces spending that would have occurred elsewhere in the local economy. Independent studies by universities and policy groups show that for every dollar of public money invested, the return to the community is minimal. Yet the deals continue because the emotional logic of sports overpowers fiscal logic every time. No mayor wants to be the one who lost the team. The owners understand this power. They use it like clockwork. When a franchise hints at relocation, fear spreads among fans and local officials. Negotiations begin. Consultants arrive with glowing reports projecting billions in benefits. Local media echo the excitement. Within months, a deal is signed. The celebration is televised. Ground is broken. The mayor smiles. The owner shakes hands. The crowd cheers. Hidden within those moments of pride are decades of repayment schedules, tax abatements, and maintenance costs that the public rarely sees until it is too late. SoFi Stadium is often presented as a privately financed marvel, yet its foundation rests on years of public investment in infrastructure, tax breaks, and favorable zoning laws. Allegiant Stadium, built to bring the Raiders to Las Vegas, was funded through a mix of private money and $750 million in public funds. Approved by the state of Nevada through hotel taxes. AT&T Stadium, home of the Dallas Cowboys, was built with the help of city bonds worth hundreds of millions, paid for by local sales and hotel taxes. U.S. Bank. Stadium in Minneapolis was financed through a package that included state bonds and city contributions totaling over $400 million. These numbers are not small details. They represent the quiet transfer of public wealth into private capital, masked by the language of partnership. The justification always sounds familiar. It is about prestige, jobs, and community pride. Supporters argue that a new stadium will transform the city's image, attract visitors, and bring energy back to struggling neighborhoods. Yet the data shows otherwise. Many of the jobs created are temporary, limited to the construction phase. The surrounding development often favors high-end retail and entertainment, pushing out the local residents and businesses who were promised opportunity. The tax revenue from these zones frequently goes toward repaying bonds rather than improving public services. What is marketed as renewal often ends up as displacement. Behind every ribbon cutting, there is a quiet ledger that tells a different story. The cost of maintenance, security, and event coordination often falls on the city. The naming rights, concessions, and television revenues flow to the team. When the stadium needs renovations, as they all do within a few years, the same pattern repeats. The team demands upgrades. The city complies, and the taxpayers pay again. It is a loop disguised as progress. The very people who fund the spectacle are the ones excluded from its rewards. There is an emotional paradox at the center of it all. The fan sees the new stadium as a gift, a tribute to loyalty and identity. It feels like validation, proof that their team matters. The owner sees it as leverage, a tool to increase franchise value and control. The city sees it as risk and reward, an opportunity wrapped in political pressure. Each of these perspectives coexists within the same structure. The stadium becomes a symbol of unity built on layers of unseen division. You can feel that paradox on opening day. The seats gleam, the banners wave, and the crowd swells with pride. The team runs out to thunderous applause, and for a moment, everyone forgets the cost. The energy feels pure, almost sacred. But as the seasons pass, the financial strain begins to show. The promised developments stall. The tax revenues fall short. The jobs disappear. The optimism fades into obligation. And yet, the love for the team remains untouched. That is the true genius of the system. It transforms civic passion into permanent debt. The American Stadium has become a cathedral, not of worship, but of commerce. Its architecture is designed to awe, to make the fan feel small in the presence of something greater. It tells a story of progress while quietly draining the resources that once funded the foundations of real progress. In this way, the stadium mirrors the modern condition of American life. Immense spectacle built on invisible cost. When I look at these colossal arenas, I do not just see buildings. I see ledgers, negotiations, and choices. I see cities trading future budgets for present glory. I see citizens celebrating victories they paid for twice once in taxes and again in tickets. The stadium, once the heart of community, has become a mirror reflecting what we have allowed pride to cost us. And still, the applause continues. It will continue because sport has always offered something that no balance sheet can: measure, hope, identity, escape. Those forces will keep the lights on long after the debts have been forgotten or at least forgiven. The question is whether we can still afford to believe that the next stadium, the next promise, will finally be different. It always begins with a promise. The mayor stands before a podium, framed by banners bearing the team's colors, speaking of rebirth and opportunity. Behind him, renderings of a gleaming new stadium fill the screens. The message is simple and stirring. This will not just be a home for the team. It will be the heartbeat of a city renewed. The narrative is powerful because it taps into a civic yearning that runs deep. The desire to be seen, to matter, to belong. Across America, struggling cities have been told that a new stadium could be the catalyst for transformation. It is presented as an investment in pride, a project that will generate jobs, attract tourists, and revive neighborhoods. Consultants arrive with glossy reports projecting billions in economic impact. Local news stations repeat the figures. Business leaders endorse the vision, and soon the idea takes on a momentum of its own. The public is told that this is not just about sports, but about the rebirth of community identity. Yet behind every promise lies a negotiation, and behind every negotiation lies a cost. When the city of Cincinnati agreed to build Paul Brown Stadium in the late 1990s, officials were assured that it would ignite downtown development and secure the Bengals' future. What followed was a financial burden that consumed hundreds of millions in taxpayer funds and decades of debt. The jobs that materialized were mostly temporary construction work. The projected tourism boom never quite arrived. Still, the narrative of renewal persisted, as it always does, because hope is more powerful than data. In St. Louis, leaders once believed a new football stadium would bring the city back to national relevance. The Edward Jones Dome was sold as a vision of the future, financed largely with public money. For a time, it seemed to work. The Rams played under the bright lights, fans filled the seats, and the city's skyline gleamed in televised broadcasts. But within 20 years, the same team that had been lured with public dollars left for Los Angeles, leaving behind debt payments and a silent arena. The promise of renewal had become the reality of loss. Proponents of stadium projects often cite the concept of the multiplier effect. The logic sounds convincing. Money spent on construction wages, ticket sales, and concessions supposedly circulates through the local economy, creating new business activity. Economists hired by teams produce studies that forecast prosperity. Yet independent research, including analyses from the Brookings Institution, and sports economists like Roger Knoll and Andrew Zimbalist, has consistently shown that these projections rarely come true. The economic gains are minimal compared to the public costs. The jobs created are short-term, the tourism transient, the tax revenues modest. Still, when a team threatens to leave, the pressure mounts. Civic leaders feel the weight of history. No mayor wants to preside over the loss of a franchise. It is not just about economics, it is about symbolism. A team represents identity, unity, pride. To lose, it feels like a civic failure. So cities open their wallets. They offer tax breaks, free land, infrastructure spending, and public bonds. Each time, they are told that this time will be different, that this stadium will be the one to lift the city. The sales pitch is rarely overtly coercive. It is aspirational. Executives talk about legacy and community impact. They speak of small businesses that will thrive, families that will gather, students who will find inspiration. The message is emotional because emotions are more persuasive than spreadsheets. When Las Vegas courted the Raiders, the campaign emphasized not just football, but transformation. The team would bring legitimacy, visitors, and energy to a city known for spectacle. Nevada's legislature approved $750 million in public funding, the largest state subsidy for a stadium in American history. Allegiant Stadium opened in 2020 at a cost of nearly $2 billion. The same story played out in other cities. In Arlington, Texas, voters were told that AT&T Stadium would revitalize their community. They approved new sales and hotel taxes to fund the project. The result was a magnificent venue and one of the most valuable franchises in sports history. Yet the surrounding neighborhoods saw little change. The stadium brought prestige, but not renewal. Small businesses found it difficult to survive on the periphery of an entertainment empire designed for the elite. Economic impact reports often cite job creation numbers in the thousands. But many of those positions are seasonal, part-time, and low-wage. Vendors, ushers, and parking attendants fill the ranks during game days. But the rest of the year, the jobs disappear. For every story of opportunity, there are others of displacement. In Inglewood, California, the site of SoFi Stadium once housed modest homes and small businesses. As the project rose, property values soared, rents followed, and longtime residents were forced to move. Renewal came, but not for those who had lived there longest. The paradox is striking. Cities chase growth through projects that often deepen inequality. Public funds meant for infrastructure, housing, or education are redirected to luxury suites and retractable roofs. The language of civic pride masks a transfer of wealth from the public to the private. Yet fans, driven by love and loyalty, cheer the ribbon cutting as if it were their own victory. The emotional connection between a team and its city blurs the line between beneficiary and burden. Some leaders genuinely believe in the promise. They see stadiums as symbols of ambition, capable of rallying divided communities around a shared identity. In struggling post-industrial cities, these projects offer a rare narrative of progress. Even when the economics fail, the psychological uplift can feel real. On opening day, when the lights blaze and the anthem echoes, the city feels reborn. For a few hours, the promise of renewal is alive. But as the years pass and the debt payments continue, reality settles in. Maintenance costs rise, teams demand upgrades, and new arenas elsewhere set new benchmarks for opulence. The cycle repeats. The public is asked to pay again, to dream again, to believe again. Each promise of renewal carries within it the seeds of its own undoing, because renewal built on illusion cannot endure. The story of stadium financing is not merely about money. 'Tis about persuasion, faith, and the enduring human desire to believe that grandeur can redeem hardship. When leaders stand before microphones and speak of legacy, they are not just selling a stadium, they are selling hope. And hope, especially when framed in the language of pride, is the most profitable commodity of all. The question remains whether the promise of renewal is worth the cost it demands. Each city must decide if the glow of its stadium lights reflects progress or merely hides the shadows that linger beneath. Before the first brick is laid, before a single blade of grass is rolled across the field, there is a playbook that unfolds behind closed doors. It is not written for coaches or players, but for lobbyists, consultants, and executives who understand that winning hearts is more powerful than winning votes. The modern stadium deal begins not in the city council chambers, but in quiet meetings at private restaurants, where public officials are shown glossy renderings of what could be. The images are always the same. Happy families walking toward a glowing arena. A skyline reborn. The dream of progress, presented as inevitability. The first step in the playbook is defining the narrative. Consultants frame the project not as a luxury for the wealthy, but as a shared investment in civic pride. The message is repeated until it becomes a kind of truth. Local leaders are told that every great city has a world-class stadium, and that falling behind is a sign of decline. Economic studies, often funded by the teams themselves, are released to show projected revenue streams. The numbers are large and persuasive, filled with promises of job creation and tourism growth. Few notice that the models assume best-case scenarios that rarely exist outside of spreadsheets. Lobbyists then move to phase 2, building alliances. Business chambers, real estate developers, and labor unions are courted. Each group is offered a vision of how it will benefit. For developers, new zoning opportunities. For unions, construction jobs. For local businesses, the hope of increased foot traffic. Slowly, what began as a proposal becomes a movement. Political figures begin to speak of the project as if it were destiny. Newspapers run editorials about the importance of progress. Skeptics are portrayed as standing in the way of the city's future. When public funding is required, the strategy becomes even more refined. Focus groups are held to test slogans. Every word is chosen for emotional effect. Terms like community investment, legacy project, and shared prosperity replace the less appealing reality of taxpayer subsidy. Public information campaigns are launched, often under names that sound grassroots, but are financed by corporate interests. In Minnesota, before the construction of U.S. Bank Stadium, advocacy efforts highlighted not the profits of the Vikings ownership, but the pride of Minnesotans. Television commercials showed children playing football in snowy parks, while a narrator spoke of legacy, unity, and home. The tone was sentimental, not analytical, because emotion wins where logic hesitates. Behind these efforts are public relations firms that specialize in large-scale persuasion. They craft messages that appeal to local identity. In Texas, they speak of independence and ambition. In California, innovation and future growth. In the Midwest, family and tradition. The playbook adapts to its environment, just as teams adjust their game plans to the opponent. The goal is always to make the deal feel inevitable, to make resistance feel like betrayal. Once the campaign begins, it floods the airwaves. Billboards, radio ads, and social media posts appear almost overnight. Star players lend their voices, encouraging fans to support the home team. The line between civic duty and fandom blurs. When citizens see their heroes asking for support, it feels personal. Few stop to ask who is paying for the ads or why they are being shown so relentlessly. In most cases, the funding comes from organizations created specifically to lobby for stadium approval, often with names that suggest community representation but list no public members. During this phase, opposition voices struggle to be heard. Economists who question the projections are labeled pessimists. Journalists who investigate the deals are accused of bias. Public meetings are structured to limit dissent, with speaking times reduced and questions pre-screened. The goal is not open debate, but controlled momentum. If skepticism spreads, it can derail the timeline, and time is the one variable lobbyists cannot afford. The longer the public thinks, the greater the chance of resistance. In Las Vegas, the campaign to fund Allegiant Stadium demonstrated this precision. Lobbyists emphasized not the $750 million in public funding, but the potential for global attention. They highlighted the Raiders' storied history and the city's transformation into a sports capital. Legislators were told that the project would diversify the economy beyond tourism. Consultants flooded local media with stories of other cities supposedly thriving after similar projects. By the time the vote came, momentum had become a tide. The bill passed with overwhelming support, though few citizens fully grasped how the debt would linger long after the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The pattern repeats across cities. Public votes are often scheduled during low-turnout elections, where well-funded campaigns can dominate. Petitions circulate, often led by paid canvassers posing as volunteers. Yard signs proclaim unity and growth. The atmosphere becomes charged with optimism. To oppose the stadium is to oppose progress itself. What makes the playbook so effective is its subtle use of shared emotion. Stadiums are not sold as financial assets, but as moral ones. They promise togetherness, pride, and identity. These are values no one wants to reject. When critics warn of fiscal irresponsibility, they sound cold and disconnected from the spirit of the city. The playbook counts on this. It turns civic emotion into political leverage. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, lawyers and financial advisors craft agreements that shift risks from the team to the taxpayers. They insert clauses that guarantee the franchise new revenue streams from parking, concessions, and naming rights. They ensure that if costs overrun, the public absorbs them. When the documents are released, they are dense and filled with technical language few can decipher. By the time watchdogs or journalists untangle the details, the deal is already done. The transformation of the modern stadium deal from negotiation to orchestration is a reflection of the power imbalance between public institutions and private franchises. Teams operate as billion-dollar brands, supported by global corporations and media conglomerates. Cities operate under budget constraints and political pressures. The result is a process that looks democratic but functions as persuasion by design. Yet there are moments when the illusion falters. In San Diego, residents rejected public funding for a new Charger stadium after years of debate. Economists, journalists, and citizen groups organized an information campaign that exposed the flaws in the projections. They asked a simple question. If the deal is so beneficial, why do billionaires need public money? When voters delivered their verdict, it was a rare display of defiance. The Chargers left for Los Angeles, and San Diego braced for the loss. But as years passed, the city found that life went on. The sun still rose, and the community discovered that identity was not confined to concrete and steel. The Playbook of Persuasion is powerful because it operates on faith. It tells citizens that greatness requires sacrifice, and that progress comes at a price. But beneath the slogans and speeches lies a quieter truth. The money that builds these stadiums could have built something else. Schools, hospitals, libraries, housing. The choice is rarely presented in such terms because clarity threatens consensus. The playbook thrives on blurred lines, on emotion over evidence, on pride over prudence. Every new stadium begins as a story of renewal. Yet in the shadows of those stories are people who will pay long after the applause fades. For them, persuasion was not victory. It was debt disguised as pride. Every stadium deal eventually reaches the same point, when excitement gives way to arithmetic. The lights, the renderings, and the promises fade into the hard reality of cost. Behind every billion-dollar project stands an army of accountants, bond lawyers, and municipal finance officers whose job is to turn private ambition into public obligation. The mechanism is complex by design. It ensures that those who benefit most never carry the heaviest weight. Public subsidies are the most visible instrument in this arrangement. They appear in the form of direct cash contributions, infrastructure spending, or tax breaks that quietly drain city budgets. When a new stadium is announced, headlines rarely include the real math. A city might pledge $200 million in public funds, but the total commitment often stretches much further. Roads must be widened, new utilities must be built, and parking facilities constructed. The cost of security and maintenance falls on local agencies. By the time the final accounting is done, the public contribution can double or triple the announced figure. Municipal bonds form the backbone of stadium financing. They are the invisible currency of civic dreams. City governments issue bonds to raise money, promising investors that taxpayers will repay the debt over decades. These bonds often extend far beyond the life cycle of the stadium itself. In some cases, residents are still paying for arenas that have already been demolished. When Seattle's Kingdom was torn down in 2000, the bonds used to build it had not yet been paid off. It was a quiet reminder that concrete decays faster than debt. To make these bonds appealing to investors, cities label them as tax-acts, which means the federal government forgoes revenue it would otherwise collect. The result is a nationwide subsidy that stretches beyond city limits. A 2016 report by the Brookings Institution found that since 2000, taxpayers across the United States had lost more than $3 billion in federal revenue due to tax-exempt bonds used for stadium construction. It is a cost borne by people who may never set foot in the facilities they helped finance. The process often begins with a promise of shared risk. Team owners and public officials announce that the project will be a partnership. In reality, the structure tilts heavily toward the private side. A city might cover 70% of the cost through bonds and infrastructure spending, while the franchise contributes the remainder through private loans or naming rights deals. The team then retains full control of stadium revenues, from ticket sales to concessions, luxury suites, and sponsorships. When profits soar, they remain private. When revenues fall short, taxpayers remain responsible for debt service. These deals are wrapped in language that obscures their true nature. Officials speak of investments rather than subsidies, of public-private partnerships rather than public liabilities. The phrase "no new taxes" appears often, but it usually means the debt will be repaid through existing revenue streams, such as hotel occupancy taxes or sales taxes. In practice, these funds could have been used for other community priorities. The opportunity cost is real, but invisible. In Las Vegas, Allegiant Stadium was financed with $750 million in public funds through hotel room taxes. Supporters argued that tourists, not residents, would bear the burden. Yet tourism is volatile, and when the pandemic struck, the same tax base that supported the stadium collapsed. The county still had to make bond payments even as revenues dwindled. What was once framed as a risk-free investment became a fiscal strain, exposing how fragile these arrangements can be when optimism meets reality. Tax exemptions add another layer to the equation. Many stadiums are classified as public facilities, even though they serve private enterprises. This allows them to avoid property taxes, saving teams millions each year. AT&T Stadium in Arlington, Texas, sits on land owned by the city, which leases it to the Cowboys at a nominal rate. Because the property is publicly owned, it is exempt from taxation. The city collects rent, but the sum pales compared to what private ownership would generate in property taxes. This pattern repeats across the country, from Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta to US Bank Stadium in Minneapolis. In Minneapolis, the Vikings' new home was funded through a combination of state bonds, city contributions, and team financing. Public officials touted the deal as balanced, but over time, the financial structure revealed deeper costs. The state's electronic pull-tab gambling revenue, intended to pay off bonds, underperformed, forcing lawmakers to redirect other funds. The project's true price tag grew quietly year after year as interest accrued. What began as a celebration of civic pride evolved into a long-term financial obligation that outlasted the headlines. Citizens often discover these realities too late. By the time the first ticket is sold, the contracts have been signed and the bonds issued. The decision-making process moves swiftly, leaving little room for public scrutiny. Hearings are held, but the language of municipal finance is dense and intimidating. Few residents understand the implications of terms like tax increment financing or lease revenue bonds. The complexity serves a purpose. The less the public understands, the less likely they are to object. There is also a moral dimension to the structure of these deals. Stadiums are often built in areas that have experienced decades of disinvestment. Residents are promised revitalization, yet the benefits rarely materialize. Property values rise, rents increase, and long-time residents are pushed out. The very people whose taxes funded the project often cannot afford to live near it. The cycle repeats as new developments cater to visitors and affluent fans. What was promised as renewal becomes displacement dressed as progress. The narrative of the taxpayer as partner is a myth sustained by careful storytelling. In truth, the taxpayer is often a silent spectator, present only to fund the spectacle. The promise of economic impact is used to justify the burden. But independent studies consistently find little evidence of net growth. The jobs created are temporary, and the revenue generated often offsets what was lost in other sectors. Stadiums shift spending rather than create it. Money spent on tickets and concessions is money not spent elsewhere in the local economy. Yet the psychological appeal of participation remains strong. When a city celebrates its new stadium, citizens feel ownership through emotional investment rather than financial gain. They see their team's colors and believe they are part of something larger. The shared pride masks the imbalance beneath it. Public funds build a monument, but private interests hold the keys. In this equation, transparency is the missing variable. Few cities provide detailed post-construction audits. Costs are often underestimated during planning and reclassified later as ancillary expenses. Maintenance and security costs persist for decades, draining public resources long after the initial excitement fades. By the time future budgets tighten, the stadium debt remains immovable. Schools, libraries, and infrastructure projects are deferred because the city must first pay for its monument to sport. The system endures because it aligns powerful incentives. Politicians gain legacy projects to campaign on. Team owners gain assets that appreciate in value. Financial institutions earn fees from underwriting the bonds. The only group without representation in these negotiations is the taxpayer, whose role ends when the debt begins. The irony is profound. The stadium, marketed as a communal gathering place, is built through a process that excludes the very community it claims to serve. Its financing model ensures that the average citizen contributes not through participation, but through obligation. The cost is hidden in hotel bills, sales receipts, and property taxes. It is collected quietly, year after year, as the lights shine brightly over the field. The taxpayer stands on the sidelines, not by choice, but by design. Their applause is heard, but their voice is not. They watch their city rise in concrete and glass, unaware that the price of belonging has already been deducted from their future. In the desert, the glow of Allegiant Stadium rises like a mirage. On game nights, it reflects the neon of the Strip, a gleaming black shell surrounded by the hum of casinos and tourists. To millions who pass through Las Vegas, it looks like a monument to success. Proof that the city once known for gambling and spectacle has become a sports capital. Yet beneath the polished surface lies a deeper truth. Allegiant Stadium is not just the home of the Raiders. It is the most expensive, publicly funded stadium in American history, built with money from people who may never step inside it. 10 years before the ribbon cutting, the idea of an NFL team in Las Vegas was considered impossible. The league had long resisted any connection with gambling. For decades, commissioners spoke of integrity, maintaining distance between football and the betting world that surrounded it. Then came the shift. The NFL's growing hunger for expansion and new revenue streams coincided with the Supreme Court's 2018 decision to legalize sports betting nationwide. Suddenly, Las Vegas was no longer a threat. It was an opportunity. The Raiders were the perfect candidate for relocation. The team had a proud but turbulent history, defined by rebellion and instability. Oakland had been its spiritual home, but the relationship between city and franchise had eroded. The Raiders played in an outdated stadium with limited luxury seating and few modern amenities. Efforts to build a new venue repeatedly collapsed over funding disputes. Owner Mark Davis wanted a state-of-the-art facility, but Oakland refused to shoulder more public debt. The city's residents had already experienced the financial strain of past sports projects. When negotiations stalled, Davis began to look elsewhere. In 2015, a new possibility emerged. Las Vegas Sands Corporation CEO Sheldon Adelson, one of the most influential figures in Nevada, saw a chance to bring the NFL to his city. He envisioned a domed stadium that would anchor a new era of tourism, sports, and entertainment. Adelson's connections in state politics opened doors that had long been closed. Meetings were held between Davis, Adelson, and Nevada's political leadership. What followed was one of the most aggressive lobbying campaigns in the state's history. The proposal was bold. A $2 billion stadium funded through a partnership between the Raiders, Adelson's company, and the state of Nevada. The key element was public funding. Advocates wanted $750 million in taxpayer-backed bonds to be repaid through a hotel room tax on visitors. It was the largest single public contribution ever requested for a sports venue. Proponents promised that tourists, not residents, would bear the burden. They argued that the stadium would create thousands of jobs, generate billions in economic activity, and transform Las Vegas into a global sports destination. The campaign unfolded with precision. A special session of the Nevada legislature was called in 2016 to vote on the measure. Lobbyists filled the hallways. Economists hired by the project's backers testified about growth, tourism, and prestige. Skeptics raised concerns about risk and precedent, but they were drowned out by a tide of optimism. The phrase "no cost to residents" was repeated again and again. Few questioned what would happen if tourism declined or if the hotel tax failed to meet projections. The bill passed swiftly, with broad bipartisan support. For the Raiders, the deal was transformative. The public subsidy covered more than one-third of the total cost. The team contributed $500 million, financed partly through an NFL loan and private investment. Adelson initially pledged $650 million, but withdrew from the project after disputes over control. Still, the public money remained. Bank of America stepped in to fill the funding gap. Construction began soon after, and within 4 years, the desert had its stadium. When Allegiant Stadium opened in 2020, it was hailed as a triumph of vision and perseverance. Politicians called it proof that Las Vegas had matured beyond its casino roots. The Black Dome stood as a symbol of ambition fulfilled. But as the excitement faded, the economic reality began to surface. The public debt tied to the project would stretch for 30 years, with total repayment costs exceeding $1 billion once interest was included. While hotel room taxes were expected to cover the payments, the pandemic brought the first serious test. Tourism collapsed, and the tax revenue nearly disappeared. Clark County was forced to dip into reserve funds to avoid defaulting on the bonds. This moment exposed the fragility of the system. A financing plan built on perpetual growth had no defense against crisis. For ordinary citizens, the supposed separation between tourist and taxpayer vanished. The same public that had been told it would never pay directly now faced the consequences of a global shutdown. The stadium debt did not pause, even when the world did. Supporters argued that the project still delivered intangible benefits. The stadium attracted major events, including the Super Bowl and college championships. It gave Las Vegas a new identity as a professional sports city. They pointed to new businesses opening nearby and the rising property values in the surrounding area. But these benefits came unevenly. The jobs created were largely temporary construction roles. Service industry employment rose slightly during event weekends, but offered little long-term stability. Critics saw a different picture. They noted that the Raiders' relocation had provided immense value to the team's ownership. The franchise, once valued at under $1 billion, more than tripled in worth after the move. The public subsidy had effectively increased the private assets value at taxpayer expense. The Raiders controlled all major revenue streams from the stadium, including naming rights, which alone brought in hundreds of millions of dollars through a deal with Allegiant Air. None of that income returned to public coffers. The story of Allegiant Stadium also revealed how public policy can blur accountability. The hotel tax mechanism insulated decision-makers from direct voter backlash. Residents did not see the cost in their property or income taxes, making it easier for officials to frame the project as harmless. Yet the same revenues could have funded education, healthcare, or infrastructure. Nevada's school system, one of the lowest ranked in the country, faced budget shortfalls even as the stadium's debt payments continued uninterrupted. The juxtaposition was striking. The city had built a cathedral to football while classrooms struggled for supplies. For many locals, the arrival of the Raiders symbolized both pride and frustration. Pride, because Las Vegas had finally earned the legitimacy it long sought from the sports world. Frustration, because that legitimacy came at a steep price. In neighborhoods far from the Strip, where wages remain stagnant and public investment scarce, the stadium feels like a distant monument. It represents a promise fulfilled for some, and a burden inherited for others. The Vegas Mirage is not about illusion alone. It is about perception carefully shaped to appear as progress. It shows how civic emotion can override fiscal caution. For visitors, the stadium is a spectacle. For residents, it is a reminder of priorities displaced. Every time the lights illuminate the night sky, they cast a shadow over the balance sheets of public finance. The Raiders' journey from Oakland to Las Vegas reflects a broader transformation in American sports economics. Teams no longer rely solely on fan loyalty or local support. They leverage mobility and scarcity, moving wherever incentives are greatest. Cities compete against one another, offering ever larger subsidies to attract or retain franchises. The result is a market where loyalty flows one way. The team owes the city nothing beyond the illusion of shared identity. As Allegiant Stadium continues to host games and concerts, it stands as both marvel and warning. It proves that any city can build a monument to ambition if it is willing to mortgage its future. It also proves that success in the modern NFL is not only measured in wins and losses, but in how skillfully a franchise can transform public goodwill into private capital. The desert sun reveals everything eventually. What looks like progress from afar may, on closer inspection, be the shimmer of heat rising from the sand. The modern stadium is no longer simply a place where the game unfolds. It has become a living billboard, a glowing monument to the marriage of sport and commerce. When a team breaks ground on a new arena, the most important deal is often not the one signed with construction firms or city officials, but the naming rights agreement that follows. The name on the roof, the logo above every seat, and the brand stitched into every televised replay are all pieces of a much larger economy of visibility. It begins long before the first fan buys a ticket. Corporations compete, not for the love of the game, but for the permanence of association. To have a name attached to a stadium is to own a piece of the nation's weekly ritual. When fans say they are going to the game, they are also repeating a brand. Sufi, Allegiant, AT&T, Mercedes-Benz, US Bank. Gillette. These are not simply sponsors. They are the new architecture of identity, fused with memory and loyalty. The emotional gravity of sport turns into measurable brand equity. Every touchdown, every camera pan, every highlight reel carries a logo into millions of homes. The deal structure behind these naming rights is as intricate as any financial instrument. Contracts run for decades, often exceeding $500 million in total value. These deals are justified by what executives call impressions, a term borrowed from digital advertising. But unlike a fleeting web ad, a stadium name lasts a generation. The cost per impression is minuscule when multiplied across the endless repetition of game broadcasts, news segments, and fan conversations. The public may have paid to build the stadium, yet the private corporation claims the profit from its visibility. Fans see the polished surface, the gleaming signs, and the curated luxury of new arenas. But beneath that polish lies a different kind of economy. Corporate suites and VIP boxes now occupy the best views of the field. They are not built for passion, but for networking. Deals are brokered in air-conditioned rooms behind tinted glass while the roar of the crowd becomes background noise. Each suite, leased for hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, turns loyalty into exclusivity. The average fan, once the lifeblood of the game, becomes a consumer in the outer circle. The stadium experience has followed a logic familiar to any corporate ladder. Access is tiered, privilege is priced, and status is visible. Club levels, member entrances, private lounges, valet parking all are designed to translate emotion into capital. When owners pitch these designs to city officials, they use the language of civic pride. They promise that these modern facilities will put the city on the map, attract visitors, and rejuvenate neighborhoods. Yet the true design serves those with the means to insulate themselves from the very communities whose taxes paid for the structure. This shift in purpose changes the meaning of fandom itself. Where once a team symbolized collective identity, it now mirrors social hierarchy. The logo on the jersey may still represent the city, but the building it plays in belongs to another world. Every branded entrance, every logo-draped corridor, every corporate event hosted on the turf reinforces the same message. The stadium is no longer public space. It is a marketplace wrapped in nostalgia. Even sponsorship categories that appear peripheral are strategically chosen. Beer brands, airlines, banks, fast food chains, all sectors that profit from repetition and loyalty. They do not need to sell products during the game. They need to remain familiar when the game ends. That is the quiet brilliance of the modern stadium deal. The event ends after 4 quarters, but the association lingers. A child grows up watching games in a branded arena and comes to see that name as part of the team's history. By adulthood, the boundary between the company and the club has vanished. Naming rights also serve as collateral for team owners. A guaranteed stream of sponsorship revenue allows them to justify higher franchise valuations. When a stadium carries a multi-billion-dollar corporate name, its financial profile becomes as sophisticated as a hedge fund. Investors view it not as a venue, but as a revenue-generating asset with predictable returns. The emotional currency of the fan base is securitized into cash flow. Public money built the foundation, but private money reaps the appreciation. The irony is that fans themselves rarely question this evolution. For many, a new stadium signifies progress. a sign that their team has arrived. The media reinforces this perception with language that blends civic pride and corporate success. Ribbon-cutting ceremonies feature governors, CEOs, and star players standing side by side, each declaring the project a symbol of unity. What remains unspoken is that the profits are divided along different lines. The corporation gains permanent exposure. The team owner gains capital appreciation. The city inherits the debt. Behind the facade of innovation lies a deeper cost. The tradition of stadium names once carried a sense of Place Memorial Stadium, County Field, Municipal Park. Those names belonged to the community, honoring soldiers, citizens, or geography. Their replacement by corporate brands marks a quiet cultural shift. It is not just the stadium that changes, but the meaning of belonging itself. The fan cheers for the same team, yet the chant now echoes inside a monument built to advertise someone else's success. The modern stadium therefore functions as a mirror reflecting the priorities of its age. It shows how entertainment, identity, and finance can merge into a single structure of influence. The roar of the crowd still fills the night, but it serves a new master. Every cheer reinforces a brand promise. Every televised moment becomes a commercial. The building itself is the product. Cities justify these transformations through the language of competition. They say that if one city refuses to finance a stadium or sell naming rights, another will. The logic of rivalry drives the system forward, ensuring that public enthusiasm can always be leveraged. The result is an arms race of architecture, where the scale of the building becomes a symbol of relevance. The cost is measured not just in dollars, but in civic identity, as communities surrender their names to corporate ones. The story of the billion-dollar branding machine is not only about sport. It is about the broader economy of attention in which every public emotion can be monetized. Fans continue to fill the seats because the game still offers escape and unity. But in the quiet hours after the final whistle, when the lights fade and the last ad runs, the truth remains visible in steel and glass. The stadium stands not as a gift to the people, but as a monument to marketing. In the world of professional sports, there is one weapon that cuts deeper than any defeat on the field: the threat to leave. It is a negotiation tactic so powerful that it can bend entire cities to the will of billionaire owners. Behind every modern stadium deal lies a quiet ultimatum, spoken in polished corporate tones but felt like a civic betrayal. Either the public helps finance the new home, or the team packs its bags and disappears. This is the relocation threat, the most effective leverage in sports business. Cities learn this lesson the hard way. They invest not only money but identity into their teams. The colors, the chants, the decades of memory become part of local pride. When that pride is suddenly held hostage, emotion overtakes reason. Fans beg mayors to act. Local media amplifies panic. Politicians scramble to find a compromise, and owners know they have already won. The story of St. Louis remains one of the clearest examples. The city built the Edward Jones Dome in the mid-1990s, a publicly financed structure meant to symbolize rebirth after years of economic decline. The Rams were welcomed back like returning heroes. For a time, the partnership appeared mutually beneficial. But 2 decades later, when the dome aged and the revenue streams lagged behind newer markets, the team's owner began to hint at relocation. The narrative shifted overnight from civic pride to civic anxiety. Proposals for renovation were rejected. Studies were commissioned claiming the building was obsolete. The city offered hundreds of millions in upgrades, yet it was not enough. The owner wanted a state-of-the-art complex in Los Angeles, a media capital with limitless sponsorship potential. In 2016, the Rams left St. Louis, leaving behind debt and disillusionment. The move was justified under the language of business, framed as necessary for growth. But to the residents who had paid for the stadium through taxes and surcharges, it felt like a betrayal. Years later, St. Louis won a settlement of over $700 million from the NFL for the deceptive relocation process. But no sum could replace the loss of identity. The city had financed the dream and then financed the heartbreak. Oakland lived the same nightmare twice. The Raiders, one of the most iconic brands in American sports, used relocation as leverage for decades. The team left Oakland for Los Angeles in 1982 after the city refused to renovate the aging Coliseum. 12 years later, they returned under promises of new infrastructure, luxury boxes, and shared costs. The public contributed heavily to improvements, convinced that loyalty had been restored. Yet, history repeated itself. When the allure of Las Vegas emerged, the same playbook was used again. The owner demanded a new stadium and hinted that Nevada officials were eager to comply. In the end, they were right. Nevada offered hundreds of millions in public financing, and the Raiders departed, leaving behind empty seats and unpaid bonds. For Oakland residents, the wound was not just financial, but cultural. The Raiders were woven into the identity of the East Bay. Generations wore the silver and black as symbols of defiance and community pride. The departure left more than a vacancy. It created a vacuum in which people questioned whether civic loyalty had any meaning in modern sports. San Diego's story follows the same pattern. The Chargers played in Qualcomm Stadium for decades, a facility once considered state-of-the-art. But as newer stadiums opened across the country with private suites and revenue-sharing deals, the Chargers' ownership began lobbying for a new venue. Public officials hesitated, aware of growing skepticism toward taxpayer-funded arenas. The team responded with a referendum that asked voters to approve increased hotel taxes for the project. When the measure failed, the owner announced relocation to Los Angeles. Fans who had supported the team through losing seasons watched moving trucks carry their franchise up the freeway to a new shared stadium, financed in part by another city's taxpayers. Each of these cases follows a predictable script. The team releases feasibility studies showing how outdated their stadium has become. Consultants issue reports projecting economic collapse if a new venue is not built. Local politicians, fearing the stigma of losing the team, propose public funding to keep them. Meanwhile, rival cities or states whisper offers in the background, creating a sense of urgency. By the time the debate reaches the public, the choice feels binary. Pay up or lose your team. The emotional nature of fandom ensures that reason rarely wins. The relocation threat thrives on asymmetry. A single billionaire owner faces a city council of elected officials bound by term limits and public opinion. The owner controls the narrative, often with the support of league executives who emphasize the importance of market potential. Television networks, sponsors, and real estate developers stand ready to profit from a move. The fan, whose tax dollars underwrite the entire process, has no seat at the table. This tactic exploits one of America's deepest civic instincts, the desire for recognition. Cities compete for relevance in a crowded national consciousness. Hosting a major sports franchise confers legitimacy. Losing one creates an image of decline. Owners understand this psychology and use it masterfully. By framing relocation as a symbol of ambition rather than greed, they convince leaders to spend public money under the guise of civic survival. The stadium becomes a test of pride rather than policy. Even after relocation, the wounds linger. The empty shells of former stadiums often become symbols of neglect. They sit idle for years, surrounded by parking lots that once pulsed with life. Maintenance costs continue, even as revenue disappears. Bonds issued decades earlier still require payment, draining funds from schools, libraries, and infrastructure. The physical emptiness mirrors a deeper realization. The game was never about community, only commerce. In some cities, new franchises eventually arrive, but the relationship is never the same. Fans approach with caution, aware that loyalty may again be weaponized. The sense of partnership erodes. Every promise of economic growth is now filtered through memory. What makes the relocation threat particularly insidious is how quietly it operates. Rarely does an owner publicly declare, "Give us money or we leave." Instead, the hints are subtle. Executives mention exploring options. League commissioners speak of evaluating markets. News leaks about meetings in other cities. The uncertainty itself becomes pressure. Civic leaders begin to negotiate out of fear rather than conviction. The National Football League, Major League Baseball, and other organizations have often turned a blind eye to these tactics, claiming that relocation is a business decision. But when nearly every relocation follows a pattern of public funding, it reveals an unspoken policy. Loyalty is conditional on subsidy. The emotional connection between fans and teams is leveraged as a financial instrument. Every season becomes a negotiation. Every cheer a currency. To understand the power of this tactic, one must look beyond the stadiums to the psychology of belonging. Teams are not just entertainment. They represent a shared identity, a weekly ritual that binds generations. Owners understand that taking this away creates not just anger, but existential loss. They use that loss as leverage, knowing that no mayor wants to be remembered as the one who let the team leave. In this dynamic, democracy struggles to compete with devotion. The relocation threat transforms civic pride into civic ransom. It exposes how the supposed partnership between team and city is built on unequal terms. The public builds, the owner profits. And when profits slow, the cycle begins again somewhere else. The cheering never stops, but the audience changes. Behind every gleaming new stadium rises an invisible world of transactions, contracts, and temporary alliances. It is called economic development, but in reality, it is a shadow economy built on short-term gains and long-term debts. When politicians announce a stadium project, they speak in the language of opportunity. They promise thousands of jobs, thriving local businesses, and an urban revival that will transform entire neighborhoods. The press conferences are filled with optimism, construction imagery, and hard hats lined up in front of cameras. Yet, when the noise fades and the cranes leave, what remains often tells a quieter, more sobering story. The promise of renewal is rarely about the citizens. It begins with developers and contractors, companies that specialize in large-scale public-private partnerships. They move from city to city, bidding on projects that can reach into the billions. Their profits are not tied to the long-term success of the stadium or the economic health of the neighborhood. They are secured in the construction phase itself. Each contract signed, each change order approved, becomes a source of guaranteed revenue. The economic model depends on movement, not maintenance. Temporary employment forms the backbone of this illusion. When city leaders claim that a new stadium will create 10,000 jobs, they are counting every short-term construction position as a measure of prosperity. These jobs often last only months or a few years at most. Workers may earn decent wages during that window. But when the final steel beam is lifted into place, the employment disappears. Studies have shown that the majority of stadium-related jobs do not translate into sustained economic improvement for the local population. They are project-based, transient, and often outsourced to non-local firms. Unions play a visible role in these developments, often supporting stadium projects as a way to secure construction work. Union leaders appear alongside politicians during announcement ceremonies, declaring victories for working families. For a time, those jobs do deliver benefits. Wages are paid, equipment is rented, and local suppliers receive contracts. But once the ribbon is cut, the workforce disbands. The city is left with an expensive facility and limited avenues for continued employment. The workers who built the stadium rarely work within it. The subcontractor network adds another layer of complexity. Beneath the main construction companies lie dozens, sometimes hundreds, of smaller firms responsible for electrical systems, concrete pouring, and materials transport. These firms operate under tight deadlines and fluctuating pay schedules. Disputes over cost, overruns, and unpaid invoices are common. Legal battles between subcontractors and general contractors often unfold years after the stadium opens, hidden from public view. The profits concentrate at the top, while smaller players navigate uncertain margins. One of the least discussed elements of this shadow economy is the role of consultants. These firms produce the economic impact studies that justify public investment. Their reports often project dramatic increases in tourism, hotel revenue, and job creation. But those projections are based on models designed to support a predetermined outcome. When independent analysts later examine the actual results, the promised economic windfalls rarely materialize. Still, the consultants are paid up front, and their studies are used as political tools to sell the dream. The same pattern appears in the financing stage. Banks and bond underwriters earn significant fees from structuring public debt used to fund stadium construction. These financial institutions have no long-term stake in whether the stadium succeeds. Their profits are secured through issuance fees and interest arrangements. In some cases, these bonds extend 30 years or more, meaning that taxpayers will still be paying for a stadium long after the companies that built it have moved on. The hidden beneficiaries often include real estate developers who acquire surrounding land at reduced prices before a stadium is announced. Once construction begins, property values in the immediate area can rise sharply, allowing these developers to sell or lease at enormous profit. In many cities, the same political figures who championed the stadium also have connections to these development firms. The lines between civic service and private enrichment blur until they are indistinguishable. For small local businesses, the promised boom often never arrives. During construction, access roads are blocked, parking becomes scarce, and long-time establishments are pushed out by rising rents. When the stadium finally opens, its internal food courts and luxury suites replace neighborhood restaurants. Fans park in designated lots, eat inside the venue, and leave once the game ends. The economic energy that once pulsed through the streets instead circulates within a closed corporate system. The stadium becomes a fortress of consumption that gives little back to the surrounding community. The story of U.S. Bank Stadium in Minneapolis reflects this pattern. During its planning phase, officials promised a surge in construction jobs and a revitalized downtown. Thousands of workers were employed during the building phase, but most of those jobs ended before the first game was played. Years later, analysts found that the surrounding businesses experienced only modest benefits. The stadium's profits flowed primarily to the team owners, the league, and a handful of corporate sponsors. The workers who had once raised the steel frame had long moved on to other projects in other cities, chasing the next temporary boom. The cycle continues because it serves the interests of those who design it. Contractors and developers rely on a constant stream of large-scale projects. Unions depend on these agreements to maintain membership and influence. Politicians use the promise of construction as evidence of leadership. Every new stadium becomes a stage for economic theater. The public sees cranes, scaffolding, and progress, unaware that much of the benefit evaporates when the lights go on. Even the language of development conceals the truth. Terms like partnership and investment suggest equality between the public and private sectors. In reality, the risks are unevenly distributed. If costs rise, the public often absorbs them through additional bonds or taxes. If profits exceed expectations, they remain with the private entities. The shadow economy thrives precisely because accountability is diffuse. No single actor bears responsibility for the outcome. The workers who experience this system firsthand often speak of pride and frustration in equal measure. They build something magnificent, only to watch it serve interests far beyond their reach. Their labor becomes part of a spectacle that ultimately excludes them. The irony is that the same men and women who construct the stadiums often cannot afford tickets to the games inside them. Over time, the pattern normalizes. Cities measure success not by the equitable distribution of prosperity, but by the number of cranes on the skyline. The temporary becomes mistaken for transformation. The economy grows in appearance, but not in substance. Behind the statistics and speeches, a small group of firms, financiers, and consultants continue to move from project to project, collecting profits while leaving the long-term costs to residents. This is the shadow economy that accompanies every major sports complex. It is not driven by fandom or civic pride, but by predictable incentives. It rewards those who can navigate contracts and connections. It's not those who live in the neighborhoods surrounding the stadium. It replaces the idea of shared prosperity with a cycle of extraction disguised as development. The structure shines on opening night, but beneath its foundation lies the quiet machinery of imbalance. When a city announces the construction of $1 billion stadium, the headline often focuses on the promised jobs, tourism, economic revival, and civic pride. The ribbon-cutting ceremony becomes a symbol of progress. A photograph of smiling politicians standing beside team owners, holding silver scissors and bold claims of a brighter future. But beneath the speeches and fireworks lies something that never makes the front page: debt. Long-term municipal debt that quietly spreads through city budgets for decades, often long after the initial boosters have left office and the cheers have faded from the stands. The financial architecture of a modern stadium deal is complex, deliberately says. The public rarely sees the full picture. Cities issue municipal bonds, often tax-exempt, to cover their portion of construction costs. These bonds are not short-term loans, but long-term obligations, sometimes stretching over 30 or 40 years. The logic presented to the public is that the stadium will pay for itself through new tax revenue, increased business activity, and regional prestige. Yet, more often than not, the projections are optimistic to the point of fantasy. What actually happens is that bond payments come due every year, regardless of whether the stadium delivers on its economic promises. In Hamilton County, Ohio, where the Cincinnati Bengals stadium deal was struck in the late 1990s, officials promised taxpayers a modern arena that would turn the city into a sports destination. Instead, the deal became a financial anchor. The county financed the project through sales tax increases and long-term bonds, assuming future revenues would offset costs. Those revenues never materialized as expected. As of decades later, the county still owes hundreds of millions, paying interest on top of principal for a facility that has already required further renovation costs. The stadium was supposed to make the region wealthier. Instead, it constrained budgets for schools, infrastructure, and essential services. This pattern repeats itself across the country. When Arlington, Texas built a TNT stadium for the Dallas Cowboys, the public share was financed with bonds backed by hotel occupancy and sales taxes. The city justified the investment by citing projected economic windfalls. Yet economists from independent universities found that the returns were far smaller than advertised. Public debt payments, however, remained constant. When the pandemic hit and tourism declined, those revenue streams collapsed, but the bondholders still had to be paid. In effect, the financial burden shifted from new economic growth to the general fund, meaning the city had to divert money that could have gone to public services. This is the hidden truth behind municipal debt. It is not just a line on a balance sheet. It is a claim on the city's future. Every dollar committed to repaying stadium bonds is a dollar unavailable for housing, education, or transit. Over time, the cost compounds. 500 million Australian dollars. Stadium may end up costing taxpayers over $1 billion once interest and refinancing are accounted for. The bonds themselves are often structured to minimize short-term political pain. Payments are backloaded, meaning they grow larger over time. The officials who approve the deal may never face the consequences. Instead, their successors and their citizens inherit the financial hangover. Consider the example of Las Vegas and Allegiant Stadium, home of the Raiders. The city's financing plan relied on a hotel room tax designed to capture revenue from tourists rather than residents. It was a clever political move. No local property taxes, no apparent burden on citizens. Yet the bonds issued were massive, and their repayment assumed a steady flow of visitors filling hotels every night. When travel restrictions during the pandemic decimated tourism, the shortfall had to be covered by public reserves. Bondholders were protected, but the city's flexibility to fund other priorities evaporated. That kind of fragility, a city's financial stability tied to the success of a football team's venue, exposes just how precarious these arrangements can be. The ripple effects of this hidden debt reach deep into municipal governance. When cities carry high levels of stadium-related debt, their credit ratings can suffer. A lower credit rating increases borrowing costs for everything else, from building schools to repairing bridges. In some cases, cities have refinanced old stadium debt just to make payments manageable, effectively pushing the problem into the next generation. These refinancing deals, while they buy temporary relief, often extend the life of the debt well beyond the stadium's useful lifespan. It is not uncommon for a city to still be paying for a demolished or replaced facility, a financial ghost haunting its budget long after the last game was played there. Take the example of Seattle's Kingdom. The stadium was demolished in 2000, yet taxpayers continued to pay off its construction debt for years afterward. The new facilities that replaced it for the Seahawks and Mariners were financed with additional public money, creating overlapping layers of obligation. The result was an entire era of civic debt built on the shifting sands of professional sports infrastructure. To the public, the skyline changed, the stadiums gleamed, and teams prospered. But the true legacy was fiscal. A pattern of debt-driven decision-making that tied the city's economic health to the fortunes of its franchises. What makes these debts even more insidious is their invisibility. Stadium bond obligations are usually hidden deep in municipal financial statements, far removed from public scrutiny. The average citizen does not read comprehensive annual financial reports or understand the long-term implications of bond servicing costs. They see the stadium, they hear about economic development, and they assume the cost was worth it. Few realize that decades later, they will still be paying for that structure through taxes or reduced public spending. By the time the bill comes due, the original boosters have often moved on to higher office, retirement, or private consulting. The political incentives encourage this cycle. Stadiums are tangible symbols of progress that can be built within a single political term. Debt, by contrast, is intangible and long-term. Politicians get to cut ribbons and hold press conferences while the debt payments are quietly scheduled 4 years later. It is a classic case of short-term political gain at the expense of long-term fiscal health. And the teams, of course, know this. Their lobbyists design deals that maximize public financing while minimizing private exposure. Team owners rarely take on significant risk. They receive state-of-the-art facilities while taxpayers assume decades of repayment. The broader effect on municipal finance is profound. Debt obligations constrain future choices. They make it harder for cities to respond to crises, invest in infrastructure, or adapt to economic shifts. When a city commits hundreds of millions to a stadium, it locks itself into a financial structure that limits flexibility for decades. In cities like St. Louis and Oakland, this rigidity became painfully clear when teams relocated, leaving taxpayers with bond payments for empty stadiums. These were not just bad investments, they were reminders of how the pursuit of prestige can mortgage a city's future. Even when cities manage to keep their teams and their stadiums operating, the long-term financial strain can erode public trust. Residents begin to see the contrast between lavish sports complexes and underfunded public schools. They question why billionaires receive subsidies while potholes go unfilled. This tension corrodes civic confidence and creates political backlash. Over time, more citizens have started to push back, demanding transparency in stadium deals and opposing tax-based financing. But the legacy of past decisions remains. The debt cannot be wished away. It must be paid. In many ways, the hidden debt of stadiums mirrors the broader American pattern of deferred costs. Just as individuals finance their homes, education, and healthcare with long-term loans, cities do the same with their civic ambitions. Debt becomes a way to live beyond immediate means, to build symbols of success today while hoping future prosperity will cover the bill tomorrow. Yet the math rarely works that way. Stadiums depreciate, maintenance costs rise, and interest compounds. What begins as a public investment in civic pride often ends as a quiet burden on generations yet to come. Behind every glittering new arena is a paper trail of obligations stretching far into the future. These are not temporary expenses, but enduring commitments. The cheering crowds may disperse, the players may retire, and even the teams may relocate. But the debt remains silent, binding, and inescapable. There is something uniquely powerful about the bond between a city and its sports team. It is not written into law or formalized through policy, yet it shapes civic identity as profoundly as any monument or institution. On game day, entire neighborhoods pulse with the same heartbeat. Flags hang from porches, streets are painted in team colors, and even those who cannot afford tickets speak of the team as if it were family. This emotional connection is the invisible currency that fuels the modern stadium boom. It transforms billion-dollar negotiations into moral battles and billionaire owners into symbols of local pride. Cities do not just host teams, they adopt them as reflections of themselves. In places that have lost industry, population, or political influence, the local franchise becomes a vessel for dignity. The team's success represents the city's resilience. When Cleveland cheers for the Browns, it is cheering for itself for survival through decline and hope through defeat. Owners and politicians know this, and they use it. Emotional manipulation becomes a quiet strategy, a way to transform civic pride into financial leverage. When an owner threatens relocation, the reaction is rarely rational. It is visceral. Citizens who would otherwise oppose corporate welfare rally to defend the team's presence. They sign petitions, attend rallies, and pressure city councils to do whatever it takes to keep the franchise. What they are really fighting for is not a sports team, but a shared identity, a sense of belonging in an era where communities are increasingly fragmented. The owner's leverage is not built on economics, but emotion. He can extract hundreds of millions in subsidies by framing his demand as a civic crisis. This tactic has been perfected over decades. In 1984, when the Baltimore Colts secretly relocated to Indianapolis overnight, the shock reverberated far beyond sports. It was a civic trauma. The image of moving trucks leaving under cover of darkness became a lesson to every other city. Lose your team once, and you may never get it back. From that moment on, mayors and governors across the country became determined not to be the one who lost the team. The fear of civic humiliation became a political motivator, driving cities to offer generous terms to keep or attract franchises. Owners understood the psychology perfectly. They turned loyalty into a bargaining chip. When the Rams left St. Louis for Los Angeles in 2016, the city's outrage was both emotional and tragic. St. Louis had already invested heavily in the Edward Jones Dome, financed with public money. The team's departure left behind unpaid debt and a sense of betrayal. Yet even in the aftermath, many fans defended the organization, placing blame on city officials instead of ownership. That is the paradox of sports loyalty. Even when betrayed, fans remain faithful. The emotional bond is too deep to sever, too tied to identity. Owners count on that devotion when they walk into negotiations. The mythology of the hometown hero complicates the issue further. When a team wins a championship, the economic benefits are often overstated, but the emotional dividends are enormous. A city that feels overlooked suddenly commands national attention. Businesses market themselves through association. Politicians bask in reflected glory, and residents feel unified. In moments like these, the idea of questioning the cost of the stadium feels almost blasphemous. The public narrative transforms from who pays to who dares complain. The very pride that should empower citizens is used to silence them. The manipulation is subtle but consistent. Team owners and their public relations departments craft messages that align their private interests with civic virtue. When they push for public financing, they talk about jobs for the community and economic revitalization. They stage press events with local youth programs, veterans, or small business owners, linking their demands to moral causes. Yet behind those images, the negotiations revolve around luxury boxes, naming rights, and tax exemptions. It is the modern equivalent of a royal court asking for tribute while promising prosperity. Fans, meanwhile, act as unpaid lobbyists. In town halls and online forums, they echo ownership talking points, not because they are deceived, but because they are emotionally invested. They fear what losing the team would mean for their city's image, for their own sense of belonging. When economists or journalists challenge the numbers, they are often met with hostility, accused of not understanding what the team means to us. That defensive instinct is precisely what allows the cycle of public subsidy to continue. The emotional manipulation does not always begin with a threat of relocation. Sometimes it starts with flattery. Owners position their teams as essential to the city's identity, the heart of the community. They speak of partnership, of shared destiny. They host charity events, sponsor local causes, and emphasize loyalty. Then, when the time comes to negotiate a new stadium, they pivot. The message shifts from unity to ultimatum. We want to stay, they say, but we need your help. The help comes in the form of taxpayer-funded infrastructure, tax abatements, or outright construction costs. The public is told this is the price of keeping their pride. The irony is that many of these same franchises operate within leagues that impose strict financial controls to protect ownership profits. Revenue sharing, salary caps, and television deals ensure consistent income regardless of local circumstances. The teams are not struggling. They are some of the most profitable entities in American entertainment. Yet the illusion of fragility persists. Owners portray themselves as victims of aging stadiums, outdated facilities, or competitive disadvantages. The city, fearful of being left behind, rushes to offer subsidies before another market can lure the team away. It is difficult to quantify the cost of civic pride, but its consequences are measurable. In Buffalo, Kansas City, and Jacksonville, taxpayers continue to shoulder costs for stadium upgrades that were justified by appeals to loyalty and fear. Economists estimate that in many of these cities, public contributions have exceeded any measurable economic return by wide margins. Still, the public rarely revolts. The emotional satisfaction of seeing one city represented on national television outweighs the long-term financial cost. It is not rational, but it is human. In some cases, civic pride becomes a form of emotional dependency. Cities with struggling economies cling to their teams as one of the few remaining sources of positive identity. Detroit, during the 2000s, is a case in point. Amid economic collapse and population loss, the Detroit Lions remained a cultural anchor. Even when the team performed poorly, the act of showing up, of wearing the jersey, was an expression of endurance. That collective emotion is powerful, but it can also be exploited. When the team pushed for new facilities, city officials felt they could not say no. Rejecting the team felt like rejecting hope itself. The story repeats because it taps into something primal: belonging. Humans need to feel part of something larger, something that represents them. In a fragmented society, professional sports have become one of the few remaining communal rituals that cross class, race, and political lines. Owners and leagues understand that power. They monetize it through television rights, merchandise, and sponsorships. And when it comes to stadium deals, they weaponize it to secure public money. Pride becomes a financial instrument, leveraged against the very people who hold it most dearly. There is, however, a growing awareness of the manipulation. As more economists and watchdog groups expose the real costs of stadium subsidies, some cities have begun to resist. In San Diego, voters rejected a ballot measure to finance a new stadium for the Chargers. The team relocated to Los Angeles, but the city retained its financial independence. Similar pushback has emerged in Oakland, St. Petersburg, and Nashville, where citizens have demanded transparency and accountability. Yet even as resistance grows, the emotional narratives remain powerful. Each time a team departs, local leaders are accused of betrayal. And the cycle of pride and pressure begins anew elsewhere. The price of pride is rarely paid in one lump sum. It accumulates over time in deferred maintenance, underfunded schools, and eroded trust in government. The irony is that the same pride that binds a community together can also be used to divide it. Those who question the fairness of stadium deals are painted as disloyal, while those who support them are seen as defenders of civic spirit. The conversation shifts from economics to identity, and in that shift, accountability disappears. A city's worth should not depend on the fortunes of a private franchise. Yet in America, where sports often fill the void left by shrinking civic institutions, the line between public identity and private profit has blurred. The emotional bond remains real, sincere, and powerful. But it has a cost. Every chant, every banner, every plea to save the team carries a shadow. The quiet realization that pride, when monetized, becomes debt. In every major city, the conversation about new stadiums begins long before the first public meeting or council vote. It starts with headlines. It starts with morning talk shows, local news segments, and network specials that frame construction as destiny. The media becomes both storyteller and salesman, turning billion-dollar deals into civic spectacles. From glossy renderings shown on sports broadcasts to emotional interviews with fans calling for a new home, the story is built not as a policy debate, but as a celebration. The networks that profit from sports have little incentive to question the economics behind them. Television rights, advertising, and sponsorship deals all depend on the spectacle remaining untarnished. A new stadium means new camera angles, new luxury boxes for sponsors, and a new wave of excitement to package for viewers. When journalists do raise concerns about public costs, they are often drowned out by the louder chorus of commentators praising investment in the future. The narrative is consistent across markets. New stadiums equal progress, growth, and pride. Local sports media plays an especially powerful role. In many cities, beat writers and radio hosts rely on access to teams for their livelihoods. They attend press conferences, travel on team charters, and depend on league credentials to do their jobs. Criticizing ownership or the financial structure of stadium deals risks exclusion. The result is a form of soft censorship, not imposed through direct orders, but through the fear of lost opportunity. The coverage becomes friendly, boosterish, and repetitive. When a team proposes a new stadium, reporters echo the press release. Economic projections provided by team-funded consultants are reported as fact, not as marketing material. The phrase economic impact has become one of the most effective tools in this media ecosystem. It is repeated endlessly, often without scrutiny. A single report claiming that a new arena will generate $2 billion in local revenue can shape public perception for years. The methodology behind such numbers is rarely explained. In reality, independent economists often find that stadiums provide minimal or even negative net benefit to cities. The promised jobs are temporary, the tourism impact overstated. Yet the media rarely revisits those early claims once the concrete is poured. The story moves on to the next season, the next storyline, the next draft pick. Television coverage, particularly national broadcasts, adds another layer of persuasion. Before kickoff, cameras pan across glittering stadiums bathed in light. Commentators marvel at the engineering, and the broadcast package refers to the structure as the new jewel of the league. It is a carefully constructed illusion. The beauty is real, but the burden is invisible. The taxpayer's contribution is not shown between replays or halftime highlights. The result is a one-sided narrative that equates architecture with advancement, convincing viewers that the city's greatness is measured by the size of its scoreboard. Even public broadcasters, traditionally tasked with critical inquiry, have struggled to resist the allure of the stadium story. Civic pride makes for compelling television. It draws audiences and avoids controversy. Investigative journalism requires time, funding, and the willingness to challenge powerful interests, including advertisers and political figures. In many markets, those resources have dwindled. Local newspapers that once served as watchdogs have been hollowed out by layoffs and mergers. Fewer reporters means fewer investigations, and fewer investigations mean less accountability. Stadium coverage becomes a vacuum filled by team statements, promotional footage, and unchallenged optimism. Sports talk radio has become the loudest amplifier of this culture. Hosts fill hours each day with speculation about trades, lineups, and rivalries. But when stadium deals arise, they shift tone. They frame the issue as a matter of loyalty rather than economics. Listeners who question subsidies are painted as cynics or outsiders. Those who support the deal are called true fans. This framing divides the audience and turns complex policy into tribal loyalty. The emotional energy that fuels fandom becomes a shield protecting ownership interests. National media outlets are not immune. Major sports networks rely on partnerships with leagues, which control access to highlights and player interviews. When those same leagues are lobbying for public financing, there is little incentive to challenge their narrative. Critical stories risk alienating the very organizations that provide the content driving ratings. A subtle alignment forms between the media's commercial interests and the league's political objectives. What results is a form of narrative capture, the illusion of coverage without true critique. Occasionally, brave reporting breaks through. Journalists at independent outlets or university research centers publish detailed breakdowns of stadium financing, exposing the real numbers. They show how tax revenues are diverted from public services, how bond interest compounds over decades, and how private profits flourish under the cover of civic pride. Yet these stories rarely dominate headlines. They are drowned out by the excitement of opening day, by the images of fans filling seats and fireworks lighting up the sky. Facts, no matter how sobering, struggle to compete with emotion. The relationship between media and power in sports mirrors a broader societal trend. Entertainment has merged with news, and spectacle has replaced scrutiny. The same anchor who interviews a mayor about education funding one night might host a pregame show from a taxpayer-funded stadium the next. The contradiction is visible, but ignored. The narrative of progress is too seductive. The new arena becomes a symbol of civic renaissance, not a financial transaction. The cost is reframed as an investment, a word that sounds responsible even when the returns never materialize. In Las Vegas, the story of Allegiant Stadium provides a clear example. Local media outlets championed the project as a triumph for the city's image, calling it proof that Las Vegas had become a major league town. Only a handful of reporters questioned the use of hotel tax, revenues to fund construction, or the long-term implications for public budgets. When those concerns were raised, they were buried beneath stories of tourism, surges, and Super Bowl projections. Years later, when hotel taxes fell short during the pandemic, the public learned what had been hidden in plain sight. The city was responsible for the debt regardless of circumstances. The stadium remained a source of pride, but the bill was real. Media influence extends beyond the moment of construction. Once the stadium is built, coverage often turns it into a symbol of unity. New segments highlight community programs funded by the team or special events hosted in the arena. These stories reinforce the narrative that the stadium gives back, softening any lingering criticism. The reality is that such programs often represent a tiny fraction of the subsidies received, yet they provide powerful imagery. The same cameras that once promoted the stadium's construction now immortalize its supposed generosity. Social media has added a new dimension to this ecosystem. Teams and leagues no longer need to rely solely on traditional outlets. They can broadcast directly to millions of followers. Through polished videos, emotional montages, and carefully curated fan testimonials, they craft a parallel narrative that bypasses journalism entirely. When public backlash arises, these platforms deploy messages of gratitude, community, and shared purpose. Critics are portrayed as negative or out of touch, while supporters are amplified as the true voice of the city. The result is a feedback loop that blurs the line between marketing and reality. The consequence of this media environment is a public conversation stripped of balance. Stadium deals are framed as celebrations rather than obligations, victories rather than transactions. Few viewers ever learn the details of bond structures, tax incentives, or long-term maintenance costs. They see only the ribbon cutting, the smiling players, the mayor's speech, and the fireworks. In that moment of spectacle, skepticism feels unnecessary, even unpatriotic. The applause drowns out the questions. The role of journalism should be to illuminate, not to echo. But in the world of professional sports, the megaphone of media often serves the powerful more than the public. The narrative of success, repeated endlessly, becomes self-fulfilling. People believe the city has won because they are told so, not because the evidence supports it. By the time the bills come due, the cameras have moved on to the next game, the next stadium, the next promise. The story of modern stadiums cannot be told without acknowledging the media's complicity. For decades, it has turned billion-dollar subsidies into fairy tales of civic pride. It has transformed complex financial instruments into feel-good stories about community spirit. It has celebrated what should have been questioned. The megaphone does not simply amplify noise, it shapes memory. And in the memory it creates, the cost disappears. Every stadium begins with a promise. It is sold as an act of creation, a monument to progress rising from vacant land. What the public rarely sees is what came before the first shovel touched the soil. Beneath every billion-dollar field lies a story of displacement, excavation, and quiet erasure. The price of spectacle is not only measured in dollars, it is measured in acres of land, lost neighborhoods, and the irreversible transformation of urban environments. The construction of a new stadium demands enormous physical space. Modern arenas sprawl across dozens of acres, consuming land once occupied by homes, small businesses, and community spaces. To create the illusion of open accessibility, cities often clear entire blocks. Eminent domain becomes the invisible instrument of progress, allowing governments to seize private property in the name of public good. But the public who benefits rarely includes those who once lived there. Residents are offered relocation payments or promises of future development. Yet history shows that the communities displaced by stadium construction seldom return. In the mid-20th century, urban renewal projects across America began reshaping city centers. Stadiums became convenient anchors for redevelopment, pitched as catalysts for revitalization. The result was a pattern that repeated from St. Louis to Atlanta, from Los Angeles to Washington. Low-income neighborhoods, often with deep cultural roots, were labeled blighted and cleared to make way for sports infrastructure. Families were forced out, small businesses shuttered, and generational networks dissolved. When the ribbon was cut years later, the people who once called the area home watched from a distance, replaced by parking lots and luxury suites. The environmental footprint of these projects is immense. Beyond the land itself lies a web of infrastructure. Highways widened to accommodate game day traffic. New sewer systems laid beneath the concrete electrical grids expanded to power colossal LED screens and climate-controlled domes. Each addition strains municipal resources. The energy required to light, cool, and maintain a modern stadium rivals that of a small town. Water usage spikes for field maintenance, concessions, and crowd sanitation. Waste generation multiplies with every event, much of it non-recyclable. Yet these realities are rarely mentioned in the celebratory narratives of ribbon cuttings and architectural marvels. Perhaps no example captures this paradox better than the construction of SoFi Stadium in Inglewood, California. Built on the site of the old Hollywood Park racetrack, the project promised economic transformation for the surrounding community. What followed was a wave of gentrification that sent housing prices soaring. Long-time residents found themselves priced out as investors poured in. Speculating on the area's renaissance, the stadium itself required massive excavation, altering the local water table and triggering environmental studies that raised concerns about flood risk. Officials insisted that mitigation measures would protect the area. But the underlying truth was simpler. Once the land was redefined by billion-dollar investment, the community's identity changed forever. The story repeats in smaller cities as well. In Atlanta, the construction of Mercedes-Benz Stadium involved demolishing two historically black churches and displacing residents from low-income housing near the old Georgia Dome. City leaders justified the move as necessary for urban growth, promising to rebuild and reinvest. Years later, many of those promises remain unfulfilled. The stadium gleams under the sun, hailed as an architectural masterpiece, while nearby neighborhoods struggle with rising rents and reduced access to basic services. Even rural and suburban sites face hidden costs. Stadium projects often expand beyond the arena itself, incorporating retail zones, hotels, and entertainment districts known as stadium villages. These developments consume green space and farmland, converting open ecosystems into concrete corridors of consumption. The environmental trade-off is stark. Wetlands drained for parking, trees cut for access roads, habitats disrupted for temporary spectacle. While environmental impact assessments are required by law, their conclusions are often softened by the economic weight of the project. A report might acknowledge moderate ecological disruption, but conclude that mitigation is feasible. Once construction begins, those mitigations often fade into bureaucratic obscurity. The strain extends to public infrastructure. Roads built to funnel tens of thousands of vehicles into one location are underused most days of the year, leaving behind vast stretches of asphalt that contribute to urban heat islands. Public transit systems stretched to meet game day surges, divert resources from regular service. Emergency services are rerouted to manage crowds, creating ripple effects across city departments. The cumulative impact reshapes civic priorities, often in ways invisible to the casual fan. Environmental sustainability has become a fashionable phrase in stadium marketing. Owners boast of LEED-certified design, solar panels on roofs, and water recycling systems. These features are genuine improvements, yet they cannot offset the scale of resource consumption involved. A sustainable stadium remains, at its core, a monument to material excess. The energy saved through green technology is dwarfed by the emissions from steel production, concrete pouring, and long-term operation. Each home game erases months of conservation gains elsewhere. Displacement leaves a psychological imprint that numbers cannot measure. Communities once defined by connection to place lose their anchors. A neighborhood bar that hosted generations of fans disappears. A family home near the old field is razed for a parking structure. The social geography of a city changes subtly but permanently. In the years that follow, new residents may see the area as revitalized, yet the memories of those displaced fade into history, unrecorded except in archives and oral traditions. The promise of redevelopment often includes new parks or public spaces, but access to these areas is limited by design. Fenced plazas, ticketed zones, and private security redefine what public means. The open land that once belonged to the people is now managed by private entities under public subsidy. The illusion of shared ownership conceals a deeper exclusion. Even environmental features, like artificial lakes or green rooftops, become aesthetic rather than ecological, serving as backdrops for marketing rather than habitats for restoration. Water use offers another window into this imbalance. Maintaining natural grass fields in arid regions requires immense irrigation. Artificial turf, marketed as sustainable, introduces microplastic pollution into local waterways. Roof systems that regulate climate within enclosed stadiums consume vast energy loads, especially in extreme weather conditions. The carbon footprint of a single season can exceed that of entire municipal operations. When cities pledge to meet climate goals, these facilities quietly stand as exceptions. Their consumption justified by economic necessity. The environmental cost is compounded by the transient nature of modern stadiums. Once built to last a century, today's arenas are replaced within decades. Technological obsolescence and shifting fan expectations drive a relentless cycle of demolition and reconstruction. Each new project consumes more land and more resources, while the previous site becomes a relic. Some are repurposed, others abandoned, their concrete shells looming as reminders of short-term ambition. The earth bears the evidence long after the cheers fade. For displaced communities, the loss is generational. The cultural bonds that once defined a neighborhood cannot be rebuilt through new infrastructure. A stadium might create temporary jobs and fleeting excitement, but it cannot replace the stability of a home, a church, or a local business. The invisible cost of progress is paid not in tax dollars alone, but in belonging. When cities evaluate the success of stadium projects, they measure revenue, tourism, and attendance. Rarely do they measure the environmental or social toll. There is no line item for lost heritage or disrupted ecosystems. Yet, those are the debts that linger, written into the soil beneath the turf. The myth of progress hides behind the spectacle of construction. Every new stadium gleams with modernity, promising rebirth for the city and its people. But beneath the polished field lies another story. One built from displacement, consumption, and erasure. What begins as a field of dreams often ends as a monument to what was lost. Every billion-dollar stadium project begins with a promise, dressed in charts and forecasts. Economic impact studies are presented like sacred texts, their numbers glowing with precision and optimism. Consultants, often hired by the same ownership groups that stand to benefit, arrive in city halls with binders filled with projections, thousands of jobs, millions in new revenue, and a rising tide that will lift every business in town. The figures appear irrefutable, armed with academic language and colorful graphs. Yet behind the surface lies a carefully constructed illusion. Independent economists have spent decades dissecting these claims, and their verdict is consistent. Stadiums do not pay for themselves. The studies that promise prosperity rely on circular logic, assuming that every dollar spent inside an arena is new money to the region. In reality, most of it is simply redirected from other local entertainment spending. A family that attends a football game is a family that will not go to a restaurant, a concert, or a movie that weekend. The net gain is negligible, yet the debt incurred by cities is immense. The University of Chicago's Booth School of Business once surveyed top economists on whether public funding of sports stadiums produced economic benefits that outweighed costs. 93% disagreed. They pointed to the evidence gathered by decades of research from places like Brookings Institution and Stanford University, showing that the promises of job creation and local growth were overstated at best, deceptive at worst. Stadiums generate bursts of construction activity, but the temporary employment disappears once the final seat is installed. The manipulation often begins in the methodology. Consultants count every hotel booking, restaurant tab, and souvenir purchase as new economic activity, even when it merely shifts money from one pocket of the city to another. They inflate multipliers that estimate how spending circulates through the economy, sometimes doubling or tripling their assumptions without justification. The resulting figures create headlines that suggest billions in impact, when the true figure might barely cross a fraction of that. Consider the case of Cincinnati, which built Great American Ballpark in 2003 under the banner of regional renewal. The project was sold on the promise of downtown revitalization and steady returns from tourism. Yet within years, county officials faced a budget crisis as the tax revenues fell short of projections. Public schools and safety departments saw cuts while debt service on the stadium remained constant. The impact study, which had predicted economic transformation, failed to account for the limits of sports-driven spending. Independent evaluations of other markets reveal the same pattern. In 2017, University of Illinois analyzed the economic claims surrounding the proposed new stadium for the Chicago Bears. Their findings were blunt. No measurable long-term economic benefit. The anticipated jobs were temporary. The tourism numbers inflated. And the tax breaks effectively transferred wealth from public budgets to private ownership. Similar results emerged from analyses of the new Yankee Stadium, where economists found that the public subsidy outweighed any financial gain by hundreds of millions of dollars. The myth persists because it is useful. Politicians need justification for handing over taxpayer funds, and these reports provide convenient cover. The language of investment and revitalization softens the reality of debt. Local media often repeat the figures uncritically, framing the project as a visionary step toward progress. The few who question the numbers are painted as pessimists or enemies of civic pride. When elections approach, the economic impact study becomes a campaign prop. Its glossy pages displayed as proof that the city is building a brighter future. Behind closed doors, however, the financial architects understand the true equation. They know that the real profit comes not from ticket sales, but from appreciating franchise values and naming rights deals. Owners gain assets that soar in worth the moment a new publicly financed stadium is announced. The public, meanwhile, inherits the debt service, maintenance costs, and opportunity loss of what could have been invested elsewhere. A library or a hospital produces no luxury boxes, but it yields something far greater: human capital and community health. Those returns, however, cannot be monetized in the glossy language of consultants. The flaw in the stadium studies is not only economic, but ethical. They present projections as certainties, implying a kind of scientific precision that does not exist. In truth, they are advocacy documents shaped to validate a predetermined outcome. Independent peer review is rarely applied, and when it is, the findings crumble under scrutiny. Economists like Roger Knoll of Stanford and Andrew Zimbalist of Smith College have spent decades exposing the inconsistencies, yet the pattern repeats with every new project. Each time, the consultants reappear with new numbers, new promises, and new ways to spin public hope into private gain. Some cities have begun to learn. San Diego voters rejected public funding for a new Charger stadium after economists demonstrated that the projected returns were unrealistic. The team left for Los Angeles, and the dire economic collapse predicted by lobbyists never materialized. Local businesses adapted, tourism continued, and the city avoided hundreds of millions in debt. The lesson was clear. Withholding subsidies does not destroy a city's economy, but it does threaten the leverage of billionaire owners. The persistence of flawed studies reveals something deeper about the culture of American sports economics. It is not only about belief in numbers, but belief in identity. Cities want to see themselves reflected in the bright lights of a scoreboard. The math becomes secondary to the myth. Economists can publish reports warning of long-term costs, but those findings rarely ignite the same emotion as the promise of Sunday afternoon glory. The stadium becomes a symbol of belonging, and in the face of that sentiment, data often dissolves into noise. Still, the evidence remains, written in the ledgers of countless municipalities. Public debt tied to stadium financing continues to absorb billions that could have funded schools, transportation, or affordable housing. Economists estimate that over the past 3 decades, American taxpayers have contributed more than $30 billion to sports venues with minimal measurable return. For every claim of revitalization, there exists a counterexample of fiscal strain, proving that the model is not sustainable. The numbers tell a simple story. If one is willing to read beyond the headlines, a stadium does not generate wealth. It redistributes it upward. The public pays twice once, through taxes and again through ticket prices. The consultants and economists who challenge this cycle often speak in calm, empirical tones, yet their conclusions echo a moral warning. A society that values spectacle over sustainability will eventually find itself cheering in the shadow of its own imbalance. The cost of applause cannot be measured only in dollars. It is reflected in the empty classrooms, the deferred infrastructure projects, and the quiet resignation of citizens who realize the numbers were never meant to add up. The studies, for all their sophistication, cannot quantify that loss. They can only obscure it, page after page, until the next groundbreaking ceremony begins. When a city approves public funding for a stadium, it is not only building a venue, it is minting private wealth. The transaction is cloaked in civic pride, ribbon cuttings, and halftime ceremonies. But beneath the surface lies one of the most effective mechanisms for concentrating wealth in modern America. A billionaire owner invests a fraction of the cost, while taxpayers shoulder the rest, and the result is a franchise whose market value explodes the moment construction begins. What is sold as a partnership is in reality a transfer and enormous upward shift of public capital into private hands. In the modern sports economy, the stadium itself functions like a financial catalyst. When public subsidies remove risk, the franchise's balance sheet transforms overnight. The new building becomes collateral for naming rights, premium seating deals, and sponsorships that would not exist without the public foundation. Owners see immediate returns even before the first game is played. Economists from Harvard and the Brookings Institution have shown that, on average, the value of a sports franchise rises by more than 30% within 2 years of securing public funding for a new stadium. For some teams, that figure approaches 50. The taxpayer, meanwhile, receives little more than sentimental ownership of an entity that will never belong to them. Take the example of the Atlanta Braves. In 2013, when Cobb County agreed to finance hundreds of millions toward what became Truist Park, the team's estimated value stood at around $700 million. Within 5 years of opening, Forbes valued the franchise at more than $2 billion. The local government's share of that success amounted to none. The public's contribution had achieved precisely what private investors dream of: risk-free growth, but the dividends flowed entirely upward. Residents, meanwhile, faced cuts to county services as debt repayments began to weigh on annual budgets. The same pattern appeared in Minneapolis, where the Vikings U.S. Bank Stadium was built with nearly $500 million in public funds. The team's valuation surged from just over $1 billion to more than $3 billion within 4 years. No major expansion of fanbase or television contract explained the increase. The stadium did. The structure itself became a symbol of creditworthiness, allowing ownership to leverage future revenues and negotiate even more favorable terms with sponsors and the league. The city, by contrast, remained locked into decades of payments. Each installment a reminder that its role had been that of financier rather than beneficiary. For franchise owners, public money transforms a team from a high-risk investment into a stable financial asset. Stadiums guarantee long-term leases and boost ancillary income through suites, concessions, and branded districts surrounding the facility. Many owners expand into real estate, purchasing the surrounding land long before the public financing is approved. Once the stadium rises, property values climb, and the same ownership groups profit from both the team and the neighborhood it reshapes. In effect, they collect twice, once from the subsidies and again from the appreciation triggered by their own publicly backed project. What makes this process particularly insidious is its invisibility. The public rarely sees the numbers that matter most: the valuations, the debt structures, the tax shelters. When the Oakland Raiders relocated to Las Vegas, the public heard about the glamour of Allegiant Stadium, the job creation, the tourism surge. Hidden in the fine print was a reality that Nevada's taxpayers had effectively financed the most significant appreciation in the Raiders' history. Within 2 seasons, the team's value jumped from $2 billion to nearly $4 billion. No private venture capital fund in the world delivers returns like that in so short a time, and certainly not without risk. Defenders of the system argue that the value of a team benefits the league, the city's image, and by extension, the community. But that argument collapses under scrutiny. Franchise appreciation accrues to the owner, who can sell the team for profit or use its heightened value to secure loans and expand business interests. Cities cannot liquidate that gain, nor can citizens redeem it. The wealth remains private, even though its foundation was public. It is the modern equivalent of enclosure process by which communal resources are fenced off and monetized by a select few. The National Football League, Major League Baseball, and other professional leagues have long understood this cycle. They operate as closed cartels, restricting the number of franchises to preserve scarcity and inflate demand. That scarcity grants owners extraordinary leverage in negotiations with cities desperate to keep their teams. Every hint of relocation adds pressure. Once a city agrees to public financing, it signals to other municipalities what the going rate for civic pride has become. The next negotiation begins with that inflated precedent. Each deal therefore raises the baseline for the next, compounding the inflation of franchise values across the league. There is another layer to the windfall, one measured not only in dollars, but in power. A publicly funded stadium cements an owner's influence within a region. Their organization becomes interwoven with local politics, development boards, and media networks. The owner transforms from a sports executive into a civic figure whose interests align less with competition on the field and more with maintaining the flow of public-private partnerships. This quiet influence ensures that when maintenance costs arise or upgrades are needed, city councils rarely resist. The precedent of generosity has already been set. The wealth transfer extends even to taxation. Many teams negotiate property tax exemptions for stadium land, arguing that the facility serves a public function. Others secure sales tax rebates on materials and concessions. When combined with depreciation deductions for the stadium and other creative accounting tools, owners can shelter millions in profits. The structure built with public money becomes, in accounting terms, an asset that generates both cash flow and tax relief. The complexity of these arrangements often hides the full extent of the gain. Only when investigative journalists or academic researchers examine the documents years later does the picture come into focus. The moral dimension of this windfall is difficult to ignore. Cities that struggle to fund public schools or maintain infrastructure divert hundreds of millions to an enterprise that enriches those already at the top of the economic ladder. The justification is emotional rather than rational, a belief that the team embodies the city's soul. That belief allows billionaires to frame their financial interests as communal ones. Fans, in turn, defend the team with loyalty that would make any investor envious. To question the owner's gain becomes, in their eyes, an attack on the community itself. Yet the evidence remains unmistakable. From Arlington to Minneapolis, from New York to Las Vegas. The moment public money touches a stadium project, franchise valuations surge. The return on investment for ownership dwarfs anything achievable in traditional markets. The public investment is irreversible, locked in for decades, while the owner retains the freedom to sell, relocate, or rebrand at will. It is capitalism without risk, subsidized by the very people who can least afford it. In this cycle, the stadium becomes a mirror reflecting the imbalance of modern society. It is a monument not to civic unity, but to the privatization of collective wealth. When the lights go out and the parking lot's empty, what remains is a contract that guarantees the owner prosperity long after the last fan has gone home. The applause fades, but the windfall endures, quietly compounding in the ledgers of those who mastered the art of turning public devotion into private fortune. For years, the story has been told the same way. A new stadium, the officials promise, will be for the fans. It will bring them closer to the game they love, create affordable experiences for families, and elevate the pride of a city that lives and breathes its team's colors. But when the gates finally open and the first crowd surges toward the turnstiles, something quietly breaks that illusion. The cost of belonging has risen beyond the reach of the people who built the team's identity in the first place. What was once a community ritual has become a transaction measured in premium seating charts, parking passes, and personal seat licenses. The promise of fan benefit is the most persuasive myth in the modern sports economy. Owners and politicians use it to justify public financing, insisting that the investment will reward the very people who pay for it. Yet the financial model of the new stadium era has done the opposite. Every modern facility, from SoFi to a TNT stadium, is engineered to maximize revenue per spectator, not accessibility. It is a system that treats loyalty as a commodity and nostalgia as a pricing tool. Consider the Personal Seat License, or PSL, one of the most effective tools ever devised to shift cost and control onto fans. Introduced in the 1990s and refined over the following decades. PSLs require fans to pay thousands of dollars simply for the right to purchase season tickets. It is not a ticket, not even a deposit, but a one-time more sometimes recurring fee to secure access. When the Dallas Cowboys opened a TNT Stadium in 2009, PSL's 4 prime seats reached as high as $150,000 each. The revenue from these licenses alone exceeded $600 million before a single game was played. Fans who had followed the team for generations found themselves priced out, replaced by corporate accounts and investment groups who viewed seats as assets rather than memories. Parking, concessions, and merchandise followed the same inflationary path. In Los Angeles, parking at SoFi Stadium regularly exceeds $100 per vehicle. A family attending a single game can spend more on parking and food than they once did on season tickets. The arithmetic of fandom has changed. The stadium that taxpayers financed has become a place where only a fraction of those taxpayers can afford to enter. The illusion of accessibility is maintained through marketing the idea that even if you cannot be there, the stadium still belongs to you. Drone footage, broadcast tours, and glossy digital campaigns create a virtual ownership that costs nothing but yields no participation. For average fans, the distance between themselves and the experience they helped fund grows wider each year. Luxury boxes, exclusive clubs, and field-level suites dominate the architectural landscape of modern stadiums. Each section is a tier in a hierarchy of access. The stadium, once a democratic space where strangers could unite under one team, now mirrors the inequality outside its walls. A select few enjoy all-inclusive privileges, while the rest watch from upper decks or living rooms, paying ever-rising cable fees to access broadcasts designed to showcase the stadium's splendor. Economists studying the phenomenon often describe it as privatized civic pride. The stadium is marketed as a community achievement, yet the actual benefits flow upward. The local fan base provides the emotion and identity that make the team valuable. But their financial contribution often comes from taxes rather than tickets. They fund the infrastructure, absorb the debt, and receive in return a structure that treats them as consumers of a brand rather than members of a community. The emotional investment remains priceless, but the economic one yields little return. In cities like St. Louis, Oakland, and San Diego, that illusion has already shattered. When teams left for new publicly funded stadiums in other cities, fans were left behind with memories and debt. The St. Louis Rams' departure for Los Angeles in 2016 cost local taxpayers hundreds of millions in lingering obligations for a stadium that would soon stand empty. Yet when the Rams reached the Super Bowl in their new home at SoFi Stadium, the franchise's marketing leaned heavily on fans everywhere and nationwide loyalty. The people who had financed their earlier success were repackaged into the brand's mythology while bearing the cost of abandonment. The emotional contradiction is hard to reconcile. Fans celebrate the construction of a new stadium as a victory, unaware that the structure's very purpose is to exclude them. The psychological power of belonging overrides the financial reality. Marketing campaigns emphasize legacy, pride, and continuity. Taglines speak of honoring the fans and building for the future. These phrases resonate deeply, because for generations, sports have been the one cultural arena where class, politics, and income could blur, at least for a few hours. The modern stadium reverses that dynamic. It enshrines division within its architecture and its pricing. In some cities, small gestures attempt to preserve inclusivity. A limited number of low-cost seats, often obstructed or far from the field, are offered to maintain the appearance of accessibility. Community programs distribute tickets to youth groups or local charities. Yet these gestures function more as public relations than structural equality. The overall pricing strategy ensures that the majority of revenue flows from premium seating and corporate partnerships. The fan becomes both prop and product, a participant in the spectacle of their own exclusion. The shift is visible even in the language of sports marketing. Fans are now stakeholders, members, and brand advocates. The word supporter, once organic and human, has been replaced by the vocabulary of business. Every cheer, every purchase, every social media post is measured in engagement metrics that feed the larger ecosystem of sponsorships and media rights. The emotional authenticity that once defined fandom is monetized, cataloged, and resold. The very act of devotion becomes data. Critics within academia and sports journalism have warned of this transformation for decades. The late economist Roger Noll describes stadiums as mechanisms for creating scarcity. By designing fewer affordable seats and more exclusive experiences, teams can justify premium pricing while maintaining an illusion of high demand. The strategy is not accidental. It is the model. The emotional scarcity of belonging fuels economic abundance for ownership. For working-class fans, the consequences stretch beyond the stadium. The civic pride once tied to attending games has shifted toward digital consumption. Broadcasts, streaming services, and merchandise become substitutes for physical attendance. While these platforms expand access, they also reinforce distance. The fan is present everywhere, yet included nowhere. The stadium looms as both symbol and barrier, a glowing monument to the price of devotion. Yet even amid this disillusionment, the myth persists. On opening day, crowds still gather outside, taking selfies near statues of legends whose names define the city's identity. They wear jerseys that cost a day's wages, sing the same chants, and tell themselves that somehow it is all worth it. That the new stadium, with its billion-dollar screens and climate-controlled suites, represents progress. In that moment, the illusion holds. It has to, because to admit the truth would be to confront the uncomfortable fact that the stadium was never built for them. It was built on them. The fans' illusion endures because hope endures. Every season begins with the same promise, the same collective heartbeat that defines American sports culture. But the architecture of that hope has changed. The modern fan cheers for a team owned by billionaires, housed in a structure financed by taxpayers, and priced for the privileged. The loyalty remains, but the ownership of that loyalty has been sold. What once belonged to the people now belongs to the market. The roar of the crowd still echoes, but its sound has changed. It is no longer the voice of a city united in shared joy. It is the echo of aspiration colliding with exclusion, of identity repackaged as inventory. The illusion is powerful, and for a moment, even knowing the truth, fans still rise to their feet, still cheer, still believe. But belief does not balance the books. It only sustains the system. Across America, smaller cities once dreamed of greatness through stadium lights. They were told that football could transform their identity, that civic investment in sports was a symbol of progress, that the right structure could lift an entire region from obscurity into the national spotlight. These were not the coastal powerhouses with endless corporate sponsors or booming populations. These were working cities built on mills, factories, and blue-collar pride, where loyalty was the one currency that never lost value. For them, a stadium was more than a venue. It was a promise. But as decades passed, that promise became a burden, and the cost of glory began to crush the very towns that once believed in it. Cincinnati was one of those believers. In the late 1990s, Hamilton County voters approved a sales tax increase to fund new homes for both the Bengals and the Reds. The pitch was irresistible. Civic leaders promised economic revival, new jobs, and revitalized neighborhoods. The Bengals' Paul Brown Stadium, completed in 2000, was hailed as a modern marvel. But within a few short years, the numbers began to betray the story. the county found itself responsible for ballooning debt, maintenance overruns, and hidden contractual obligations that drained the public budget. Schools faced cuts, public services shrank, and the dream of economic rebirth dissolved into a fiscal trap. By 2011, county officials admitted the stadium deal had become unsustainable. Residents paid millions each year to keep the lights on, while the team, valued in the hundreds of millions, continued to profit. Buffalo tells a similar story, though with a different kind of heartbreak. The Bills, one of the league's most beloved franchises, have long been tied to the spirit of Western New York. The community's devotion is absolute, their loyalty unshakable, even through decades without a championship. Yet behind that devotion lies a painful truth. Erie County and New York State have poured hundreds of millions into the Bills' facilities over the years, with limited economic return. In 2022, a new deal was struck for a state-of-the-art stadium, costing over $1.4 billion. More than $800 million would come from taxpayers. The justification followed the same script: jobs, tourism, pride. But independent analysis showed that actual financial benefits would be minimal, mostly short-term construction gains and negligible long-term growth. In a region already facing economic stagnation, public funds once meant for education and infrastructure were redirected toward ensuring that a private franchise remained in town. St. Louis stands as perhaps the most painful example of all. In the 1990s, the city courted the Rams with promises of a publicly funded dome that would guarantee economic growth. Voters approved the plan, driven by hope that the NFL's return would rejuvenate their downtown. For years, the city paid faithfully, servicing the debt as attendance waned and the team's performance faltered. Then, in 2016, the Rams relocated to Los Angeles, leaving behind a half-empty dome and more than $100 million in outstanding debt. The taxpayers continued to pay for a stadium that no longer housed a team. The betrayal cut deeper than dollars. It was emotional, a civic wound that exposed the imbalance between loyalty and leverage. Years later, St. Louis sued the NFL and the Rams organization for breach of contract, eventually securing a $790 million settlement. But even that victory felt hollow. The city had lost its team, its pride, and decades of trust in the promises that once sold the dream. These smaller markets are not outliers. They are case studies in a nationwide pattern. The same formula repeats itself from one generation to the next. A team threatens to leave or hints at needing upgrades. Consultants arrive with glossy presentations forecasting prosperity. Politicians, wary of being labeled anti-sports or anti-progress, rally behind the deal. Voters, fueled by civic pride, approve new taxes or bonds. Construction begins, and for a brief moment, hope fills the skyline. Then, the bills come due. The projected boom fails to materialize. Public budgets strain under the weight of debt payments that last for decades. And yet, when the next promise is made, the cycle begins again. The emotional dimension of these sacrifices cannot be understated. In places like Buffalo or Cincinnati, the team is not merely entertainment. It is heritage. Generations pass down fandom as if it were faith. Politicians understand this and exploit it. When ownership groups claim that without a new stadium, the team may relocate, communities respond with fear and urgency. The thought of losing that symbol of unity is unbearable. This vulnerability becomes a financial weapon. The teams negotiate from a position of emotional dominance, knowing that the public will do almost anything to keep its identity intact. The leverage is complete, the manipulation effective, and the outcome predictable. What remains afterward is a quieter form of loss. Taxpayers see little tangible benefit. The promised revitalization zones often stall or fail to deliver sustained growth. Local businesses near the stadiums experience temporary booms during events, but return to struggle once the novelty fades. The economic footprint of a modern stadium is smaller than advertised, and much of the surrounding area remains unchanged. Meanwhile, city budgets tighten. Parks close, libraries reduce hours, infrastructure repairs are delayed, and essential services compete for dwindling funds. The stadium shines under bright lights, a symbol of civic achievement. But beyond its walls, the city that paid for it grows dimmer. For small markets, the disparity between contribution and reward is especially cruel. Large cities can absorb the cost, spreading the burden across larger tax bases and wealthier populations. Smaller regions cannot. Every dollar spent on debt service is a dollar not spent on public welfare. The psychological effect deepens as residents realize the imbalance. The stadium, once a monument of pride, becomes a daily reminder of misplaced trust. In Cincinnati, county officials estimated that over the 30-year life of the stadium bonds, taxpayers would contribute more than $1 billion in total, including interest. Meanwhile, the Bengals franchise value climbed to over $3 billion by 2024. The same pattern repeated elsewhere. The teams became wealthier than ever, while their home cities remained financially constrained. The notion of partnership between franchise and city revealed itself as illusion. It was never a partnership, only an arrangement of convenience in which the public carried the risk and the private entity reaped the reward. Even as these truths became public, the allure of football proved stronger than the sting of financial loss. Residents still filled the stands, wore their team colors, and celebrated victories as if the economic reality did not exist. Sports are emotional currency, and emotion does not always answer to arithmetic. But underneath the cheers lie exhaustion, a quiet recognition that the sacrifice made by small towns was not shared equally. They gave their loyalty, their money, and their trust, only to watch that investment leave with the next relocation threat or ownership demand. The story of small-town sacrifice is a story of power. It reveals how deeply the NFL understands its role as both sport and cultural institution. The league's leadership knows that in America, few things bind communities more tightly than football. That bond is sacred, and because it is sacred, it can be monetized. In towns like Buffalo and Cincinnati, loyalty becomes collateral. Civic faith becomes a financial instrument. The emotional economy of football sustains the monetary economy of ownership. Still, amid the imbalance, these communities endure. They rebuild their sense of pride through resilience rather than spectacle. They continue to gather in bars, on porches, and in living rooms to watch their teams, even as they question the cost. The irony is that the same devotion that makes them vulnerable is also what keeps the spirit of the game alive. Without these small markets, without their heart and their history, the league would lose its authenticity. But in the current system, authenticity has become another commodity to be exploited. Every city that has paid this price carries a lesson. The lights fade, the confetti fall, and the debt remains. The scoreboard resets, but the balance sheet does not. For every new stadium that rises, another community must tighten its belt. The small-town sacrifice continues because hope remains more powerful than caution. Yet the question grows louder with every deal signed and every promise broken. How long can the illusion of renewal justify the cost of decline? In the twilight glow of American prosperity, the stadium has become the perfect mirror. It gleams, immense and proud, a monument to wealth surrounded by neighborhoods that cannot afford the tickets to enter it. This is not just about football or baseball or basketball. It is about what the country chooses to celebrate. When billion-dollar stadiums rise beside underfunded schools and shuttered hospitals, they no longer stand for community. They stand for hierarchy. The same impulse that built the mansions of industrial barons now erects glass palaces for team owners whose fortunes are measured in billions. The names on the gates have changed, but the logic is the same. The few build their empires, and the many help pay for them. This new Gilded Age hides behind the language of civic pride. Team owners appear beside mayors and governors, shaking hands and speaking of renewal. They call the stadium a gift to the city, an investment in its soul. Yet the gift always arrives with a bill attached, one that the public pays for decades. The financing deals are structured so elegantly that most citizens never notice the cost until it is far too late. Bonds stretch 40 years into the future. Tax abatements erase revenue streams meant for public goods. The returns flow upward, compounding the fortunes of men already insulated from consequence. The modern sports magnate does not need to break laws to extract value. He only needs to understand that civic desperation and nostalgia are currency. Every struggling city dreams of being seen. Every mayor wants ribbon cuttings and headlines. When a billionaire arrives with a promise to build a stadium that will place the city back on the national map, few dare to question the terms. The illusion of shared glory conceals a private bargain. Public funds cover the risk. Private interests keep the profit. Inequality does not only live in spreadsheets, it lives in how people move through the world. In the new stadium economy, luxury suites replace general admission. Premium zones, VIP entrances, and branded lounges divide fans into classes as efficiently as any tax code. For those who can afford it, the game is no longer about the score. It is about proximity to privilege. For those priced out, the team that once represented their city now exists behind paywalls and glass. The divide is not symbolic. It is engineered. Across America, the same pattern repeats. In Las Vegas, the promise of prestige justified public subsidies that dwarfed education budgets. In Los Angeles, SoFi Stadium became a global showcase funded by a complex web of tax incentives. In Arlington, residents paid through their property taxes for the right to host one of the richest franchises on earth. Each deal was hailed as visionary. Each one deepened inequality. The workers who cleaned the construction sites often could not afford rent in the shadow of the arena. The temporary jobs disappeared when the ribbon was cut. The tax burdens lingered long after the confetti settled. This gilded architecture tells a story about values. It reveals how public institutions now serve private ambition. The old social contract that once bound wealth to responsibility has eroded. Where the industrialists of the past, at least, felt compelled to leave libraries and universities, the new elite builds temples to their teams. The gesture is not philanthropy. It is branding. The owner's legacy is measured in naming rights and drone footage, not in endowments for learning or public service. The paradox is that the spectacle still unites people, even as it divides them. The roar of the crowd creates the illusion of shared purpose. For 3 hours on Sunday, fans believe they belong to something larger than themselves. But the infrastructure of belonging has been commodified. Every chant, every jersey, every hot dog contributes to a machine that feeds inequality. The modern stadium thrives because it transforms passion into profit. It weaponizes identity and sells it back to the people who already paid for the building. Economists have tried to quantify this imbalance, but the true impact is cultural. Stadiums have become civic cathedrals of consumption. They signal that success is not measured by education, safety, or opportunity, but by the size of the screen above the field. When mayors cut budgets for housing yet find hundreds of millions for sports facilities, the priorities of governance are exposed. It is not just economic mismanagement, it is moral inversion. In many ways, the rise of stadium wealth parallels the broader concentration of power in American life. Just as tech billionaires monopolize attention, sports billionaires monopolize identity. They control the symbols through which people express civic pride. The jersey becomes a flag. The arena becomes a capital. The loyalty of fans is both their devotion and their vulnerability. Cities that cannot afford to lose their teams surrender to financial terms they would reject in any other context. The inequality embedded in stadium economics also reshapes geography. Entire neighborhoods are raised for parking lots and access roads. Gentrification follows the path of the arena's shadow, displacing those who once lived closest to the team they loved. The civic fabric that sports once strengthened is now torn by the same force that claims to renew it. The price of a new skyline is often a vanished community. And yet, the story endures because it appeals to something deeply human. People want heroes, shared rituals, and symbols that transcend politics. The billionaire owner knows this. He presents himself not as a businessman, but as a steward of tradition. The city's identity becomes his asset. The people's devotion becomes leverage in negotiations. The same tactics that once built railroad monopolies now secure stadium deals. The Gilded Age has returned. Only this time, the tycoons wear team colors. There is no single villain in this system. The voters who approve subsidies often do so out of hope, not ignorance. The mayors who sign the contracts believe they are saving their cities from decline. The problem lies in the illusion that public money can purchase private glory. Once that illusion takes hold, accountability fades. Every new stadium is justified by the last one. Every debt rationalized as investment. The cycle continues, polished by media coverage and civic pride, until inequality becomes invisible under bright lights and pyrotechnics. The Gilded Age of sport does not hide in boardrooms. It lives on the screens that celebrate its triumphs. Each touchdown, each sold-out concert, each drone shot of a glittering roof reinforces the myth that these structures belong to everyone. In reality, they belong to a few, financed by the many, sustained by faith in the story that the game is for all. The truth, however, remains visible in every crumbling school beside a billion-dollar dome. The cost of inequality is not measured only in dollars. It is measured in trust, in the quiet disillusionment that follows the applause. When the lights fade and the crowds disperse, what remains is not civic pride, but civic exhaustion. The Gilded Age thrives because it teaches people to cheer for their own expense. In that contradiction lies the true genius of the modern stadium economy, and the true tragedy of the cities that keep believing. Behind every glittering arena lies a web of contracts, statutes, and financial engineering designed to disguise the true cost of construction. What appears as private investment often rests on foundations of public obligation. The system depends on complexity. It thrives on the assumption that ordinary citizens will not read the fine print. Every line of a bond agreement, every clause in a tax code, every acronym in a city council briefing serves one purpose: to convert civic pride into corporate subsidy while maintaining the illusion of fiscal responsibility. This is the legal end-around. It is not corruption in the traditional sense. It is a sophisticated choreography between public officials, private developers, and financial institutions. Each player understands their role. The city provides the appearance of control. The team owner promises prosperity. The law firms and bond underwriters construct the legal fiction that reconciles the two. To the voter, the stadium seems privately financed. To the accountant, it is a public liability dressed in legal precision. One of the most effective instruments in this playbook is the pilot agreement, or payment in lieu of taxes. On paper, a pilot allows a team or developer to make payments that substitute for property taxes, usually at a much lower rate. The justification is always the same. The stadium will generate economic activity and therefore deserves relief. In practice, these agreements shield billion-dollar facilities from contributing to the very communities that fund their infrastructure. Streets are repaved, transit routes expanded. Police and fire services increased, all without the venue paying its proportional share. The city presents the arrangement as mutually beneficial. The benefit, however, is largely one. Another pillar of the legal architecture is the tax-exempt municipal bond. These instruments are the quiet heart of the stadium finance model. By issuing bonds through a public agency, cities can borrow money at lower interest rates because investors do not pay federal taxes on their returns. The stadium is then leased to the team under favorable terms, and the team's rent payments are structured to cover the debt. On balance sheets, this can be framed as self-sustaining. But the reality is that tax exemptions represent foregone federal revenue money that could have supported schools, infrastructure, or healthcare. In 2012, a Congressional Budget Office study estimated that the use of tax-exempt bonds for sports facilities had cost the federal government over $4 billion since 1986. That number has only grown. The legal mechanisms have evolved with each wave of public backlash. When direct subsidies became politically unpopular, cities and teams began rebranding them as public-private partnerships. The language shifted, but the underlying dynamic remained the same. The public assumes the risk. The private party reaps the return. Even federal reforms have struggled to keep pace. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act sought to restrict the use of tax-exempt bonds for stadium projects. Yet developers found new routes, such as using infrastructure authorities or tourism districts to keep the benefits intact. The NFL's relocation boom in the 2010s illustrates how legal innovation follows financial opportunity. In Las Vegas, the creation of a special tax district allowed hotel room levies to fund nearly 3/4 of Allegiant Stadium's public share. The state issued bonds. The Raiders signed a lease, and the structure was framed as a partnership rather than a handout. In Atlanta, the Mercedes-Benz Stadium benefited from hotel-motel tax revenues authorized decades earlier. Each case relied on existing legal frameworks designed for tourism development, repurposed for billion-dollar franchises. The public perception of legality created comfort. Few noticed how far these uses stretched legislative intent. Even the definition of ownership blurs within this system. Many stadiums are technically owned by public authorities, which lease them back to teams for nominal fees. The arrangement provides the illusion of public control while insulating private owners from property taxes and liabilities. In some cases, it also enables the issuance of tax-exempt bonds, since the facility is publicly owned. The irony is striking. The public holds title to an asset they cannot afford to enter, financed through mechanisms they do not understand, while the private tenant captures the revenue streams that the asset generates. At the local level, lawyers and consultants act as translators of this complexity. They present city councils with glossy presentations and thick binders of feasibility studies, each stamped with the language of legality. The deals are timed carefully, often rushed through during lame duck sessions or holiday weeks when scrutiny is low. Public hearings are held, but the technical nature of the material discourages dissent. Officials speak of revenue, neutrality, and creative financing, knowing that the real implications are buried in footnotes. Once approved, these contracts bind cities for decades. The law becomes a scaffold that supports inequality. Critics have tried to challenge this system in court, but the statutes are designed to withstand scrutiny. Judges often defer to the legislative process, ruling that if elected officials approve the bonds or subsidies, the courts have little authority to intervene. The law thus becomes both shield and sword. It legitimizes what would otherwise appear unethical. It transforms public giveaways into civic investments. And because the documents are public, the illusion of transparency protects those who profit most. Independent economists have long warned that these mechanisms distort the intent of municipal finance. Public debt, they argue, should be reserved for projects that yield broad social benefit. Water systems, transit networks, schools, stadiums fail that test. Their returns are concentrated, their lifespans limited, their opportunity costs immense. Yet the legal flexibility of municipal authorities makes them attractive vehicles for private enrichment. A single vote can redirect hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars without violating a single statute. The moral dimension is perhaps the most difficult to legislate. Laws can regulate transactions, but they cannot regulate civic vanity. When politicians fear losing a team or being labeled anti-business, they bend the legal framework to accommodate the deal. Clauses are added, exemptions expanded, definitions rewritten. The result is a document that satisfies every technical requirement while betraying the spirit of public stewardship. These contracts become artifacts of compromise, monuments to the art of appearing responsible while acting otherwise. Even at the federal level, reform efforts face resistance from powerful lobbies. Sports leagues employ legal teams that monitor tax legislation and draft model statutes for sympathetic lawmakers. The complexity of municipal finance provides them cover. By the time reforms reach the floor of Congress, they are often diluted or filled with exceptions. The public sees only headlines about economic growth. The true machinery remains buried in the pages of bond covenants and lease agreements. In the end, the legal endurance succeeds not because it hides the truth, but because it reframes it. A subsidy becomes an incentive. A tax break becomes a partnership. A debt becomes an investment. Each term softens the perception of exploitation. The average taxpayer may never know that the new stadium they celebrate is financed by obligations stretching beyond their lifetime. The law, in its precision, creates distance between cause and effect. What emerges is a system that rewards complexity over clarity, legal ingenuity over public benefit. The stadium economy has become a case study in how legality and morality can diverge. What is lawful is not always just, and what is transparent is not always fair. Yet as long as the lights shine and the games are played, few will question the contracts beneath them. The law provides comfort even when it conceals inequity. And so the machinery turns, invisible and efficient, converting civic faith into private fortune. In the beginning, the stadium was a place of gathering. It was an arena where communities came together to celebrate skill, courage, and collective identity. But over time, the stadium became something else entirely. It became a currency of prestige, a weapon in a global competition for attention and status. The modern sports arena is no longer just a field of play. It is an architectural declaration of power. And the United States, with its billion-dollar stadium boom, exported that model to the rest of the world. What began as a uniquely American obsession has evolved into an international arms race of spectacle. The foundation of this race was laid in the closing decades of the 20th century, when American cities discovered that stadiums could symbolize ambition. The era of intimate ballparks and community fields gave way to vast structures designed for television, sponsorship, and political legacy. Every new project had to be taller, brighter, and more expensive than the one before. Owners, politicians, and architects learned to use design as messaging. The bigger the arena, the stronger the city appeared. This mindset, amplified by globalization and the media's fascination with grandeur, soon crossed borders. By the 21st century, the logic of the American stadium had gone global. London's transformation offers a vivid case study. For generations, English football had been defined by history and intimacy. Places like Highbury and White Hart Lane were shrines of tradition, beloved precisely because they felt human. But when the Premier League exploded into a global business, the old grounds could no longer compete with American-style arenas. Arsenal's Emirates Stadium opened in 2006, marked the beginning of a new chapter. It was sleek, commercial, and laden with corporate hospitality zones. The club sold naming rights to a global airline. The new venue became not just a home ground, but a financial instrument, built to maximize revenue from every seat and suite. Tottenham followed with a billion-dollar structure designed to host both soccer and American football, complete with retractable pitches and luxury experiences. In just 2 decades, London went from heritage to hypermodernity, mirroring the financial logic of the NFL. Across the Atlantic, Los Angeles embodied the same ideology on an even grander scale. The city's return to NFL relevance through SoFi Stadium was not just about football. It was a statement of supremacy. The project's cost surpassed $5 billion, a figure that defied economic rationality but perfectly captured cultural ambition. Its completion transformed Inglewood, a working-class neighborhood, into a global stage for concerts, Super Bowls, and Olympic ceremonies. The developers spoke of civic renewal, echoing the same language that had justified countless American projects before. But beneath the grandeur lay displacement, gentrification, and rising housing costs that pushed long-time residents away. Sufi became the physical embodiment of the global stadium model, an aesthetic marvel financed through debt, hype, and civic aspiration. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the world, Qatar redefined the scale of ambition entirely. The 2022 World Cup was the most expensive sporting event in history, with estimates surpassing $200 billion when including infrastructure. The tournament's centerpiece stadiums were monuments of engineering precision, each built to impress the world and legitimize a nation's geopolitical rise. For Qatar, sports architecture was not just entertainment but diplomacy. Hosting the world's biggest event was a strategic investment in soft power, a chance to assert relevance on the global stage. The labor that built those cathedrals of sport came from the developing world, and the human cost was high. International reports documented thousands of migrant worker deaths, long hours, and oppressive living conditions. Yet when the first whistle blew, the narrative shifted back to spectacle. The moral discomfort faded beneath the glare of lights and fireworks. The same story unfolded in other corners of the globe. China's investment in megastadiums ahead of the 2008 Olympics reshaped Beijing's skyline. The bird's nest and the water cube were celebrated as architectural triumphs, but later stood underused reminders of the transient nature of spectacle. In Brazil, the stadiums built for the 2014 World Cup and 2016 Olympics left behind billions in debt and maintenance costs. Some were converted to parking lots or warehouses. The promise of global prestige proved fleeting. Like American cities before them, host nations discovered that the economic benefits of these projects rarely justified their price. What binds these cases together is a shared psychology. The stadium, once a tool for community gathering, has become a symbol of modernity itself. Nations and cities compete to outshine one another in architecture, technology, and spectacle. To build bigger is to appear stronger. The pattern mirrors the logic of an arms race. Each new project drives the next, escalating cost and complexity while offering diminishing returns. Success is measured in aerial photos and global headlines, not in long-term social benefit. The global diffusion of the American model also reflects a deeper cultural export, the commodification of civic pride. Just as U.S. franchises persuaded cities to subsidize stadiums in exchange for prestige, nations now use mega-events to rebrand their identities. Sports economists call it the halo effect. Hosting a major event or unveiling a record-breaking venue is said to enhance international reputation, attract investment, and boost tourism. Yet independent studies continue to find the same result. The short-term glow fades, leaving behind debt and disillusionment. The pattern repeats, not because it works economically, but because it works emotionally. In Qatar and Los Angeles, the pursuit of global recognition took on the same language of inevitability. Leaders described the projects as necessary investments in the future. Critics were labeled pessimists or obstructionists. The construction itself became a moral narrative of progress. In each case, the public bore the unseen cost. Whether through taxes, displacement, or opportunity cost, ordinary people financed the dreams of elites. The system transcended borders but maintained its hierarchy. There is also an environmental cost to this global competition. The energy demands of air-conditioned stadiums in desert climates, the concrete and steel emissions from construction, and the massive waste generated by mega-events contribute to a growing ecological burden. Sustainability has become a marketing feature, with venues boasting of recyclable materials and solar panels. Yet the scale of these projects contradicts the message. The very idea of building temporary or oversized facilities for limited events runs counter to environmental responsibility. The global arms race rewards spectacle, not restraint. Behind the grandeur lies another truth. The stadiums themselves are rarely designed for the communities that surround them. In many host cities, residents cannot afford to attend the events they subsidize. Ticket prices cater to corporate clients and tourists. Neighborhoods lose access to public land, and small businesses struggle to survive the shift from local commerce to controlled concession economies. The same dynamics that defined American stadium politics now play out in every region that seeks global validation through sport. This transformation reveals a paradox at the heart of globalization. The spread of the American stadium model has unified the visual language of power. From Doha to London to Los Angeles, the structures look familiar. Shimmering glass, towering LED screens, vast concourses lined with luxury lounges. They represent technological mastery and corporate ambition. But beneath that aesthetic uniformity lies a deeper fragmentation. The more cities invest in spectacle, the less they invest in shared humanity. The stadium becomes a mirror reflecting inequality on a global scale. For all its complexity, the global arms race in sports architecture stems from a simple desire to be seen. Nations and cities crave recognition, and sport remains the most efficient medium for global attention. The American model provided the blueprint. Leverage public money, promise renewal, deliver prestige, and move on before the bill arrives. The result is a world where stadiums rise faster than schools, and where the applause of a global audience outweighs the quiet needs of local citizens. Yet history offers a quiet warning. Every empire of spectacle eventually faces its reckoning. When the lights fade and maintenance costs mount, when the global cameras move elsewhere, what remains are the debts, the empty seats, and the echoes of promises never fulfilled. The modern stadium is both triumph and tombstone, a monument to ambition, built on borrowed faith. And as this model spreads further, the question grows larger. How much longer can the world afford to chase glory that cannot sustain itself? By the late 2010s, the tide began to turn. The same cities that once courted billionaires with open checkbooks and tax-exempt bonds started to question the morality of it all. Voters who had long accepted the stadium hustle as a civic tradition began to see it as a betrayal. The reckoning came quietly at first, in the form of public hearings, citizen watchdog groups, and investigative reports that stripped away the glossy renderings and empty promises. For the first time in decades, there was genuine resistance to the idea that pro sports were untouchable. In St. Louis, the battle scars from the Rams' departure still glowed fresh. The city's taxpayers were left paying tens of millions in debt for a stadium that no longer had a team. When the NFL and the Rams' ownership orchestrated the team's relocation to Los Angeles, city leaders sued, accusing the league of deception, breach of contract, and bad faith. What followed was one of the most revealing legal confrontations in sports history. The case never reached trial, but the league quietly agreed to a $790 million settlement. The message was unmistakable. Public institutions could fight back, and sometimes they could win. Elsewhere, activists began to dig through the fine print of new stadium deals. In Las Vegas, journalists uncovered that nearly $750 million in taxpayer-backed bonds had financed Allegiant Stadium, despite earlier assurances that the Raiders' move would rely primarily on private money. In Arlington, Texas, citizens sued over the seizure of private land through eminent domain, arguing that a publicly funded stadium for the Cowboys did not serve a public purpose, though courts ultimately sided with the city. The case drew national attention to how easily the concept of public benefit could be manipulated. Grassroots movements emerged in places like Oakland, San Diego, and Atlanta, where residents had grown weary of subsidizing billionaires, while local schools, transit systems, and hospitals begged for funding. Economists began testifying before city councils, armed with data proving what fans had long suspected. The economic impact of stadiums was often overstated by factors of 10 or more. Jobs were temporary. Most revenue left the community, and maintenance costs persisted long after the ribbon-cutting ceremonies ended. What citizens received in exchange were higher parking fees, restricted access, and an enduring sense of betrayal. In Minneapolis, the $1.1 billion U.S. Bank Stadium became a symbol of this awakening. Built with nearly $500 million in public funds, It soon faced lawsuits over inflated construction costs, contractor disputes, and even bird deaths from its mirrored facade. State auditors discovered discrepancies in how luxury suite revenues were reported. When citizens demanded transparency, the oversight authority resisted, citing private business confidentiality. The irony was hard to ignore: a building paid for by the public, shielded from public scrutiny. Watchdog organizations like Good Jobs First and the Brookings Institution began compiling comprehensive databases of subsidies, uncovering billions in hidden costs buried in local budgets. Their findings revealed that stadium subsidies had outpaced spending on libraries, parks, and even affordable housing in many mid-sized cities. This data empowered voters and activists alike. In places like San Diego and Miami, proposed stadium referendums were defeated by overwhelming margins. Cities began to demand that teams pay for their own venues, or at least share profits proportionally to public investment. Legislative efforts followed. Lawmakers in several states introduced bills to limit or ban the use of public funds for private sports facilities. In 2017, U.S. Senator Cory Booker and Senator James Blankford introduced a bipartisan proposal to eliminate the federal tax exemption for municipal bonds used in stadium construction. Though the bill failed, it marked the first serious federal challenge to the system in half a century. In New York, state assembly members pushed for mandatory financial disclosures for many franchise-seeking public support, even the government accountability. Office issued reports calling for transparency in how stadium deals were justified and financed. The backlash was not just about money. It was about trust and who the modern sports economy really served. Cities like Cincinnati and Cleveland faced tough questions from residents who noticed that neighborhood revitalization projects promised alongside stadium construction never materialized. Economists began comparing the outcomes of stadium cities with those that had refused subsidies. The contrast was stark. Cities that said no often saw stronger long-term fiscal stability and diversified economies, while those that said yes found themselves tethered to decades of debt and deferred maintenance. The narrative began shifting from civic pride to civic responsibility. Fans still loved their teams, but they no longer blindly accepted that love should come with a tax bill. When Nashville proposed another new stadium for the Titans less than 25 years after building the last one, public hearings turned into protests. Citizens demanded proof of return on investment, equity in decision-making, and guarantees that profits would stay within the community. The very idea of what a public-private partnership meant was being rewritten. Journalists became key players in this reckoning. Investigative pieces from outlets like The Atlantic, ProPublica, and The Guardian exposed how lobbyists shaped legislation to benefit team owners, how consultants inflated economic impact projections, and how mayors used stadium deals to advance political careers. The public began connecting dots between campaign donations, construction contracts, and naming rights agreements. The system that once hid behind the veil of sportsmanship was being illuminated by data and scrutiny. In 2022, the residents of Oakland faced the ultimate test. The Athletics sought massive public subsidies for a new waterfront ballpark, promising jobs and development. But after years of delays, cost overruns, and broken trust from the Raiders and Warriors departures, the city's patience was gone. Local coalitions mobilized, citing environmental risks and fiscal irresponsibility. The message was loud and clear: no more blank checks. When the A's eventually announced their plan to relocate to Las Vegas, Oaklanders mourned, but also felt vindicated. They had refused to be used again. The reckoning extended beyond city halls into courtrooms. Taxpayers in St. Louis, Las Vegas, and Miami began suing local governments for misrepresentation or breach of fiduciary duty. Some demanded refunds or injunctions to halt future projects until financial disclosures were complete. Though few suits succeeded, their symbolism was powerful. For the first time, citizens were not passive participants, but active challengers to the sports industrial complex. At the same time, reform-minded officials began reimagining what community-centered sports investment could look like. Instead of billion-dollar stadiums, they funded local recreation centers, public athletic programs, and infrastructure that directly benefited residents. The new ethos was simple. If sports are to unify a city, they must do so through inclusion and shared prosperity, not elite exclusivity. Cities like Portland and San Antonio showcased how sustainable development could coexist with professional franchises without massive subsidies. As the public skepticism deepened, owners and leagues adjusted their strategies. They rebranded deals as entertainment districts, bundling stadiums with housing and retail to claim broader economic benefits. Yet watchdogs quickly pointed out that even these districts often relied on public bonds and tax abatements. The language had changed, but the economics had not. The reckoning forced everyone to confront a basic truth. No amount of branding could disguise a subsidy. By the early 2020s, the conversation had reached a cultural level. Late-night hosts joked about taxpayer team ownership. Economists debated on national television whether stadiums were modern-day cathedrals or financial sinkholes. The myth of endless growth through spectacle was crumbling under its own weight. And yet, amid the cynicism, there was something liberating in the transparency. Citizens were no longer dazzled by architectural renderings or seduced by ribbon cuttings. They were informed, engaged, and unwilling to accept old narratives. What began as scattered protests had evolved into a national movement for fiscal and moral accountability. Stadium deals were now political risks, not automatic victories. Every mayor, every council member, every commissioner who signed one understood that public opinion had shifted. The age of unexamined deals was over. In its place stood a fragile but growing belief that cities could reclaim their power. That fandom could coexist with fairness, and that civic pride need not come at the expense of civic integrity. The reckoning was not complete, but it had begun. And for the first time in generations, the people footing the bill were finally part of the conversation. By the mid-2020s, the stadium industry stood at a crossroads. After decades of unchecked expansion, public backlash, and legal scrutiny, the old model of taxpayer-funded monuments to private wealth was under siege. The next blueprint for sports, architecture, and finance would need to answer a question that once seemed unthinkable. What if the public simply refused to pay? This was not a hypothetical anymore. Cities were saying no. Legislators were closing loopholes, and fans were demanding proof that billion-dollar projects actually served them. The age of unquestioned subsidies was giving way to an era defined by accountability, innovation, and sustainability. Architects, urban planners, and economists began to reconceive what a stadium could be. No longer just a vessel for spectacle, the new generation of venues would need to justify their footprint both economically and ecologically. Design started emphasizing flexibility, retractable roofs, modular seating, and spaces that could host concerts, community events, and conventions with minimal reconfiguration. The goal was to ensure that stadiums remained active year-round, not silent monuments used only a handful of days each season. This shift reflected a deeper realization. For a building that cost over $1 billion, civic utility had to extend far beyond Sunday afternoons. Sustainability became more than a buzzword. Venues like Climate Pledge Arena in Seattle and Allegiant Stadium in Las Vegas began integrating renewable energy systems, advanced water recycling, and carbon-neutral construction materials. LEED certifications became the baseline expectation, not the exception. These efforts were not purely altruistic. They were driven by changing public attitudes and stricter regulations. Fans who once prioritized convenience now wanted to know that their teams were part of the solution, not contributors to climate decline. The next blueprint of stadium design was as much about moral credibility as it was about engineering. Private financing, long treated as a rarity, began to evolve into a genuine alternative. Wealthy owners, venture funds, and even fan cooperatives explored new models of investment. The Green Bay Packers community ownership model, once considered an anomaly, gained renewed attention as a template for civic partnership. In Europe, clubs experimented with mixed financing where a combination of private equity, ticket levies, and corporate sponsorship replaced public subsidies entirely. In the United States, a few forward-looking franchises began testing bond structures tied to future revenue streams rather than city guarantees. It was a quiet revolution, proof that billionaires could indeed build their own temples if they were forced to. Technology played a transformative role in this shift. The next wave of stadiums was not just about physical architecture, but digital integration. Smart ticketing systems reduced scalping and improved data transparency. Virtual reality experiences allowed fans to attend games remotely in immersive environments, lowering physical attendance pressure while expanding revenue potential. Some teams introduced subscription-style memberships, offering flexible access to digital and in-person events. These innovations redefined what fan engagement meant, offering an experience less dependent on geography and more connected to shared identity. The stadium of the future was becoming a network, not a location. Urban planners, once sidelined in the rush to please team owners, reasserted their influence. They began demanding that stadiums integrate seamlessly into their environments rather than dominate them. Mixed-use developments now prioritized affordable housing, public parks, and transit access over luxury condos and exclusive clubs. The financial reckoning also transformed how negotiations unfolded. Public officials demanded full transparency before approving any deal. Independent audits became mandatory. In some cities, citizen panels were established to evaluate proposed subsidies and community benefits. Teams were required to publish economic impact statements verified by third-party economists. The opaque backroom agreements that once defined stadium politics were increasingly untenable. Transparency was not just a gesture. It was a new prerequisite for legitimacy. Those who refused to comply faced public outrage, lost elections, and activist campaigns that could derail projects before ground was even broken. Culturally, the fanbase itself was changing. Younger generations, shaped by social responsibility and environmental awareness, viewed the stadium debate through a moral lens. They expected their favorite teams to uphold values that aligned with broader societal goals. Franchise image was no longer built solely on wins and championships, but on ethics and authenticity. This evolution had tangible consequences. Brands and sponsors became cautious about attaching their names to controversial deals. Investors demanded sustainability reports. For the first time, reputational risk carried real financial weight in professional sports. Globally, the lessons of America's subsidy crisis began influencing other nations. Qatar's extravagant World Cup projects sparked discussions about labor, ethics, and environmental destruction, forcing a reckoning even in state-funded economies. In Europe, where fan-owned clubs remained common, the backlash against super leagues and privatized access reinforced the value of community stewardship. London's Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, one of the world's most technologically advanced arenas, demonstrated that innovation could coexist with fiscal responsibility when financed primarily through private means. The world was watching the United States not as a model to follow, but as a cautionary tale of what unchecked sports capitalism could become. In this climate of reform, a few cities began to pioneer bold experiments in equitable financing. In Sacramento, civic leaders proposed a shared investment model where public contributions were capped at infrastructure improvements, roads, transit, utilities, rather than direct stadium costs. In Nashville, activists successfully pushed for a clause requiring that a percentage of stadium-related profits fund affordable housing, and local education programs. These measures were modest but groundbreaking. They represented an evolution from subsidy to partnership, from extraction to reciprocity. The blueprint was changing, and cities were no longer apologizing for demanding their fair share. Architects, too, began reimagining stadium aesthetics to reflect this new social compact. Gone were the massive facades designed to dominate skylines. The next generation of stadiums emphasized transparency, both literally and symbolically. Glass walls opened to city streets, public plazas invited community use, and pedestrian bridges connected fans directly to urban centers. Stadiums no longer aim to isolate fans in luxury. They aim to integrate citizens in participation. The architectural statement had shifted from grandeur to belonging. Economically, the data began to vindicate the reformers. Cities that resisted subsidies experienced fewer long-term fiscal burdens and higher credit ratings. Teams that financed their own venues often operated with greater independence and profitability. The narrative that public money was necessary for success collapsed under empirical evidence. The myth had sustained itself for decades through emotional manipulation, the threat of losing a team, the promise of prestige, but once numbers replaced nostalgia, the logic unraveled. Stadiums did not need to be public liabilities. They could be private ventures that coexisted with civic pride rather than exploiting it. Still, the struggle was far from over. For every progressive model, there remained powerful forces defending the old order. Lobbyists continued to circulate polished reports exaggerating economic benefits. Politicians still sought photo opportunities beside shovels and hard hats. And fans, caught between loyalty and principle, often found themselves torn. Yet the difference was awareness. The public now understood the machinery behind the spectacle. Illusions once hidden behind architecture and advertising had been replaced by facts and accountability. The next blueprint for stadiums will not be uniform. It will evolve city by city, shaped by local values, resources, and ambitions. But one thread will remain constant: the insistence that sports infrastructure must serve people, not the other way around. The stadium will endure as a symbol, but its meaning will change. It's no longer a monument to excess. It can become a platform for inclusion, innovation, and sustainability, a reflection of what communities value, rather than what corporations demand. The blueprint is still being drafted, its lines uncertain, and its future contested. Yet for the first time in generations, the conversation belongs not to billionaires or lobbyists, but to citizens, architects, and fans. The spectacle of sports has always mirrored the society that builds it. And now, perhaps, that mirror is beginning to show something new. A vision of fairness, responsibility, and shared pride. A future where the price of belonging is measured not in taxes or tickets, but in collective purpose. The lights fade, the crowd disperses, and the echo of a final whistle drifts into the night air. In that lingering silence, the truth begins to surface. What remains after the game is not just the scoreboard or the highlight reel, but the debt, the faith, and the shared illusion that something sacred has taken place. America has always built temples to its passions, from cathedrals to shopping malls, from skyscrapers to stadiums. The architecture of this country has been an expression of what it worships, and in the 21st century, nothing has rivaled the stadium as a monument to belonging. Yet beneath its steel and glass, beneath the artificial turf and polished concourses, lies the cost we rarely acknowledge. We tell ourselves it is worth it, that the price of pride is justified by the roar of the crowd and the shimmer of a championship banner. But when the confetti is swept away, it becomes harder to ignore what we have mortgaged for that fleeting moment of unity. Across the nation, cities that once believed in the promise of renewal now wrestle with the weight of their choices. Bonds outlast the memories of the games they financed. Schools struggle while luxury boxes gleam. Public services shrink while corporate revenues climb. Still, we line up each season to do it all again, compelled by something deeper than logic or economics. We pay because the act of paying has become an expression of identity. It is easy to blame the owners and the politicians, the consultants and the broadcasters. But the truth is more complicated. The machine persists because we feed it. We buy the tickets, wear the jerseys, and defend the deals even when we know the arithmetic does not add up. It is not ignorance that drives us, but longing. In a fractured world, stadiums promise communion. They offer a sense of unity rare in modern life, a place where strangers become neighbors through shared emotion. For a few hours, the divisions that define daily existence seem to dissolve. That illusion of togetherness, however brief, is powerful enough to justify any price. This is the paradox that defines America's love affair with the game. A country built on individualism gathers by the tens of thousands to lose itself in collective identity. A nation that prides itself on fiscal prudence continues to sign blank checks for spectacle. We speak of freedom, but bind ourselves to franchises that can leave at any moment. We glorify competition, yet build systems that guarantee the rich cannot lose. The contradictions are everywhere, and yet they feel strangely comforting. The stadium is not just an arena for sport. 'Tis a mirror of the national psyche, reflecting our ambitions and our denials in equal measure. In that reflection, there is beauty and tragedy intertwined. The beauty lies in the faces of fans who believe. The father lifting his child to see the field for the first time. The grandmother wearing the same hat she wore 50 years ago when her team first won it all. The college students painting their faces in colors that connect them to something older and larger than themselves. They are not thinking about tax bonds or financing schemes. They are thinking about belonging. And in those moments of pure devotion, it becomes clear why the cycle endures. People do not gather for economics. They gather for meaning. Yet meaning without memory becomes manipulation. We forget too easily the lessons left behind by the cities that fell for promises unfulfilled. We forget that civic pride should not require civic debt. That sports were once rooted in community rather than commerce. That victory, when purchased with public money and private gain, begins to lose its moral gravity. Every generation faces the temptation to believe that this time it will be different, that this new stadium will finally pay for itself, that the next deal will finally make sense. And every generation learns again that the math of belonging does not balance. The cost is not only measured in dollars, it is measured in what we allow to decay while we build our monuments. Libraries with leaking roofs, clinics without funding, public housing waiting for repair. The sacrifices are often invisible, dispersed across budgets and neighborhoods, but they are real. Each seat sold at a premium, each corporate logo on a scoreboard exists within a larger equation of priorities. When we decide that the spectacle of sport deserves more than the security of community, we reveal the values we are willing to trade. Still, the story is not entirely one of loss. Change is possible, and it has already begun in small ways. Communities are learning to say no. Citizens are asking harder questions. Some cities are finding strength in collective refusal, discovering that the power once assumed to belong only to owners and politicians can shift back to the people. Fans are beginning to see that love for a team does not require blind loyalty to its business. There is a slow awakening taking place, a recognition that belonging can be built without submission, that pride can exist without debt. The next era of the American Stadium may be one of reckoning rather than revelation. It will demand that we confront the myth we have lived under for decades. That greatness requires excess. That unity demands sacrifice. That identity must always come at a price. The truth is more humble and more human. We do not need billion-dollar cathedrals to feel connected. What we need are spaces, public or private, where the spirit of the game can exist without exploitation. What we need is honesty about what we are building and who it is truly for. When the lights go out and the last fan leaves, the stadium remains, glowing faintly against the night sky. It stands as a reminder of both our achievement and our amnesia. Future generations will walk past these structures and marvel at what we once deemed essential. Some will see them as symbols of pride, others as monuments to misplaced faith. Both interpretations will be true. That duality is the essence of the American story. Hope and hubris sharing the same foundation. In the end, perhaps the price of belonging is not something to be solved, but to be understood. We pay because we crave connection, and connection is rarely free. The question is not whether the cost is justified, but whether we can learn to recognize its weight before we agree to bear it again. Every roar of the crowd is built on silence that came before it, on decisions made in boardrooms and voting booths, on promises of renewal that fade long before the next season begins. So the next time the lights rise over a new arena, gleaming like a beacon of civic pride, perhaps we will pause before celebrating. Perhaps we will remember the towns that paid too much, the people who believed too deeply, the generations still paying for games long forgotten. Perhaps in that brief hesitation, there will be space for something different, accountability, humility, and a quieter form of belonging that does not demand worship, but invites reflection. Because in the end, the true measure of a nation is not in the size of its stadiums, but in the strength of its conscience. And the echo that lingers after the cheering stops will not be applause. It will be the sound of a question that refuses to fade. What did we trade for the feeling of belonging, and was it worth it?